Colonial Parkway Murders. Llandudno, the largest seaside resort in Wales, welcomes nearly 9,400,000 visitors annually. The charming town is famed for its sweeping bay, Victorian-era architecture, and its unique location between the Great and Little Orme headlands. It features two scenic beaches that enhance its coastal allure. Sophie Louise Hook was a 7-year-old girl born to Julie and Christopher Hook in Cheshire, England on May 27, 1987. Julie worked as a teacher, while Christopher was employed at an advertising agency. The couple married in 1984 and had 4 children: 9-year-old Gemma, 7-year-old Sophie, 5-year-old Joseph, and baby Ellie, who was just 1. Gemma and Sophie shared a particularly close bond and loved spending time together. Neighbors recalled the Hooks as a warm and joyful family, with Sophie noted as the most outgoing of the children. She was remembered as cheerful and kind-hearted. The Hooks were also very close with Julie's sister, Fiona, and her husband Danny Jones, who lived in Llandudno, North Wales. The Jones family, like the Hooks, had 4 young children of their own. Those who knew both families well said the connection between all 8 children was so close, they felt more like siblings than cousins. On July 29, 1995, the Joneses invited the Hooks to join them in celebrating their son Luke's 9th birthday. That morning, the Hooks had breakfast and then made the hour-and-a-half drive from Cheshire to Llandudno to take part in the festivities. At the time, the Joneses lived in a large home on Brynlabia Road in Llandudno, valued at £200,000 in 1995. Their backyard was private and well-suited for children, bordered from a nearby overgrown bridle path by a hedge and wooden gate. It made the perfect setting for a lively afternoon, with the children splashing in a pool, spraying each other with the hose, and playing in a brand-new tent gifted by their grandparents, Pearl and Paul Roberts, for the occasion. The kids were thrilled with the tent and pleaded with their parents to let them camp out in it that night. Julie and Christopher agreed, reassured by the garden's security, the glow from the nearby patio lights, and the fact that Fiona and Danny would be sleeping just a few meters away inside the house. Julie and Christopher recall kissing their children goodnight when they left them to their camping sleepover in the garden. Julie later recalls that she kissed them goodbye and said to them, quote, "Have a good time. I'll see you tomorrow." This would be the last time they would ever see 7-year-old Sophie alive. Sophie, her sister, and 2 of their cousins, Luke and Alex, settled down in their sleeping bags in the tent. They ate dinner, played games, and shared ghost stories. Feeling scared, the younger boy, Alex, opted to head indoors at 12:30 a.m. At 12:40 a.m., his father, Danny, decided to check up on the kids before going to sleep. He left the back door open in case any of the kids decided to come inside. At 2:30 a.m., Sophie's cousin Luke woke up, checked the time, and noticed that Sophie was still in the tent asleep between himself and her sister. He went back to bed. However, the next morning, Luke woke up around 7:15 a.m. and found his cousin Sophie missing from the tent. The tent's entrance was open and damp from the morning ring. Luke noticed that while Sophie was gone, Sophie's beloved stuffed giraffe named Blankies, whom she took everywhere, remained inside the tent. He knew that she and Blankies were inseparable and later said, if Sophie had run away, she would have taken him with her. Luke immediately notified his parents. Fiona and Danny searched the garden and the house as well as the surrounding fields for over an hour, but no trace of Sophie could be found. Sophie was officially reported missing to the police at 8:20 a.m. Unbeknownst to Sophie's family, an hour earlier around the time Luke had woken up and found Sophie missing, a gruesome discovery was made by a local man. At 7:10 a.m., 55-year-old Jerry Davies set off from home to begin his usual dog walk down North Shore Beach. While walking along the shore, he spotted what appeared to be a discarded mannequin. However, he knew something was wrong when his dogs became alarmed and ran away from the scene. He decided to investigate the mannequin only to realize it was the body of a girl. Davies took off his t-shirt and laid it over her lifeless body before rushing to a nearby phone box in order to dial 999, the country's emergency number. The girl was later identified as Sophie Hook. Her unclothed body was found washed up on the beach half a mile away from her home. The following autopsy report is extremely graphic and viewer discretion is advised. The autopsy revealed that Sophie had been brutally attacked. Her right upper arm and her ankle had been broken. She had been slapped and punched and her body was covered with bruises. She had suffered internal bleeding and was sexually assaulted. The medical examiner noted that a majority of her injuries were comparable to those normally suffered by people killed or seriously injured in major car crashes. All of the injuries were sustained while she was still alive. The coroner said that during the attack, Sophie had been in so much pain that she left teeth marks on both sides of her tongue and inside her lower lip. She ultimately died of strangulation. Her body had been thrown into the sea near a cliff called the Little Orme located at the eastern end of the promenade. Her time of death could not be determined as her body temperature had dropped due to the cold seawater. It was determined that her body had been in the water for at least 3 hours. The crime shocked the town. Sophie's family was inconsolable. Her mother said, "Gemma is coping extremely badly. She is totally and utterly distraught, and it is very difficult to comfort her. She is so utterly sad and angry." Gemma later said, "I want to be in heaven with Sophie." Police had a difficult task of finding the killer, as the killer had tried to remove any forensic evidence by throwing her body into the sea. Her clothes, a distinctive pink and white Winnie the Pooh night dress, her underwear and a pair of Marks and Spencer socks embossed with pink flowers were never found. Authorities believe whoever murdered Sophie knew that the children were staying in the garden tent. Police started their investigation by interviewing all the nearby registered sex offenders. Soon, investigators would focus upon one individual in particular, a 30-year-old man named Howard Hughes. He was known to ride his mountain bike through the coastal town late at night. He had a striking appearance as he grew up quite rapidly due to a chromosome abnormality called XYY syndrome. He reached 6 feet tall by age 11 and was towering at 6 feet 8 inches in adulthood. He also had behavioral problems, learning disabilities and dyslexia as a child. As a child, Hugh Hughes was placed in private schools by his father, who hoped they would have a positive influence on him. However, after only 2 terms at Lindisfarne College in Wrexham, the school chose not to continue his enrollment. Even when Hughes' father offered to pay double the tuition, the school declined, citing Hughes' frequent involvement in fights and bullying. This pattern of aggressive and disruptive behavior persisted throughout his adolescence and into adulthood. Hughes developed an extensive criminal record, including convictions for assault, burglary, theft, criminal damage, threats, driving offenses, and weapons possession. At just 16 years old in 1981, he lured a 7-year-old boy into a deserted building. According to the arrest report, Hughes exposed himself, made inappropriate advances, and eventually attempted to strangle the child. The young victim later recalled, "He picked me up and slammed me down hard. He was frighteningly strong. He ended up on top of me, gripping my neck with both hands." The boy pretended to be dead until Hughes left. Hughes was convicted of assaulting the boy and placed under a 2-year mental health supervision order. On release, returned to live with his mother, recently separated from his father. Following his release, he became increasingly aggressive and violent in nature, picking fights with people at random. His disruptive behavior led to an inability to maintain any job. Despite his father offering him various roles within his business over the years, Hughes declined to contribute in any capacity. Instead, he caused damage to machinery and engaged in altercations with fellow employees. Hughes had also been accused of assaulting young girls aged 3, 5, and 9 in the years between his release and 1995. Hughes came under suspicion when multiple witnesses spotted him cycling along a path which overlooked Sophie's location. One woman actually caught him hiding in the bushes, and he told her he was looking for money he had dropped. The past proximity to the property meant that he could potentially overhear the children's conversations, which indicated that he may have been aware they were sleeping in the garden that night. Moreover, that night at 2:55 a.m., Hughes was seen sitting on a bench near the promenade by a police officer who talked to him while patrolling the town. The police later discovered a shoe print on a rhubarb leaf in the Jones garden, which upon examination indicated a potential match with Hughes' shoe. Hughes was arrested at the home he shared with his mother at 3:50 p.m. on the same day the body was discovered. He was detained at the police station, and during his questioning, he constantly denied any involvement in the murder. He confirmed that he roamed all over the area, including having been on the bridle path that ran behind the Joneses' house that day. He also confirmed that he was out and about in the early hours of July 30th when he was spoken to by a police officer. However, he denied killing Sophie. He was held for 4 days, but as there was not enough evidence to charge him, he was released from prison. Hughes was soon rearrested after police found images of children which had been located in a police search of his home. Officers had also found a collection of girls' undergarments hidden in a stone wall. Soon other evidence came to light, albeit circumstantial. A 6-year-old girl named Amanda Roberts came forward to say that she had been playing in a park near her home that Saturday afternoon when she was approached by Hughes at around 4 p.m. He tried to persuade her to go with him, but the girl ran away. That park was less than a 4-minute cycle ride from the Joneses' house. A convicted sex offender, Michael Gedd, also came forward. He claimed to have known Hughes and his mother while he was a neighbor of theirs. He told police that Hughes would often share his twisted sexual fantasies about assaulting young girls with him. He said that there was more than one occasion when they had a conversation, and that he said that he wanted to abduct a girl to have intercourse with her and then to murder her. Police allowed Hughes' father to visit in response to his request for welfare visits. During that visit, Hughes reportedly confessed to sexually assaulting and murdering Sophie. Hughes told his father the route that he had taken when he kidnapped Sophie. Hughes' father, after learning the truth, told police that his son had confessed to the murder during their visit. He also gave information to the police concerning the location of the child's clothes. Sophie's night clothes were later found in the area indicated. Howard Hughes was officially charged with the kidnapping and murder of Sophie Hook. On the June 24, 1996, his trial began. Only Christopher Hook and Danny Jones attended the trial, as they did not want Julie and their children to be re-traumatized. There was no forensic evidence linking Hughes to the crime, but the jury heard testimony of 3 witnesses, one being Hughes's own father. He addressed the court and spoke of how his son had confided to him that he had murdered Sophie. His father told the court that when he went to visit his son in jail, he told him, quote, "If I am going to stay in this room with you, I must know if you did it." His son then allegedly broke down and admitted, "I did it." Howard Hughes described how on that Saturday morning, he went to the Joneses' back garden where the children were preparing for the party. He said, "I went back there at about 2 in the morning. I persuaded a girl to go with me down to the beach. The girl started screaming and I put my hand over her mouth and kept it there until she stopped. I took off all her clothes and threw her body into the sea." He followed up his statement by saying, "I've been sexually frustrated since 1990. Hughes later went on to deny this confession. The defense argued that his confession may not have actually been to her murder, but only in an effort, he said, to help authorities find Sophie's clothing, to which his father said, quote, "You can suggest what you like, but that is rubbish." The second witness was Jonathan Carroll, a 30-year-old career criminal who was in prison at the time he testified. He told the jury that he had been out looking for places to rob. He was in a garden when he heard someone coming up the street. A few moments later, he saw Hughes carrying a sack down a lane. He then says he caught a glimpse of a human leg coming out of the sack. The third witness was Michael Gedd, who told the jury how Hughes had previously confessed about sexual fantasies he had regarding assaulting young girls. In addition to the testimonies of other witnesses, the court also heard from those who placed Hughes near the bridle path on July 29th, as well as Alexandra Roberts, whom Hughes attempted to lure later that day. The court dismissed any suggestions that Sophie had willingly accompanied Hughes. Sophie's mother, Julie, stated in a written statement that she and her husband had always taught Sophie the importance of staying away from strangers. Julie emphasized that Sophie was cautious and would not have gone with Hughes on her own. There was speculation that Hughes had forcibly taken Sophie from the tent. It was believed that, when Hughes first lifted Sophie, she might have thought it was one of her parents. By the time she realized it wasn't, it was already too late. Hughes denied any involvement in the 7-year-old's murder. He rejected claims that he had spoken with Michael Gedd and refuted the idea of confessing to his father, asserting that his father had fabricated the story to have him removed from the area. When questioned about Sophie's clothing, Hughes claimed that he had found the nightdress on the side of a road, about half a mile from the house near a derelict property. He said he picked it up intending to use it as a substitute for toilet paper, though he never did, and instead carried it for a while before discarding it over a hedge. Prosecutors alleged that Hughes had gone to great lengths to ensure that there was no forensic connection between himself and the body. They told the court that he had shaved off his pubic hair before the murder to ensure that there was no forensic connection between himself and Sophie. Hughes was known to wear the same jacket for months on end without ever washing it. However, he reportedly had it laundered after the murder. On the July 18th, the jury returned a guilty verdict on all 3 charges against Howard Hughes. The 31-year-old was then given 3 life sentences. The judge, Mr. Justice Curtis, recommended that he should never be released from prison. On the November 24th in February 2002, it was announced that he would have to serve a minimum imprisonment of 50 years before consideration for parole. This ruling has enabled Hughes to be eligible for release in February 1945 at the age of 80. Following Sophie's death, a brass plaque was erected on the beach in her memory. Following Sophie's murder, her family struggled with overwhelming guilt. Julie condemned the killer as the most evil and monstrous person imaginable, expressing, "I just feel numb, totally and utterly numb. I think most people believe in good. It's very difficult to comprehend that somebody could be so evil." She added, "I protected my children so much. They weren't allowed to cross the road on their own. We both feel very, very sorry that the one time she needed us most, we were simply not there for her. That feeling will never go away." Moving on to the next case. Chrissy Venn. Chrissy Venn was a 13-year-old girl living in Tasmania, Australia, when she disappeared after leaving her home on Allison Road. At around 5 p.m. on Saturday, February 26, 1921, Chrissy set off from her family's property, which was surrounded by farmland and dense forest, roughly 3 miles from the town of North Mawton. Not long after, 2 boys, sons of prominent local farmer and landowner John Herbst, reported hearing a single, high-pitched scream coming from the nearby woods as they worked in the fields. Despite this, they chose to ignore the sound. When Chrissy failed to return by 7 that evening, her mother, Eva, walked along Allison Road in search of her daughter but found no trace of her. By the next morning, dozens of local residents had joined the search effort, though each day's search ended with no new leads. Then, at 11:30 a.m. on Tuesday, March 1st, a group of searchers began combing a deep ravine located about half a mile from the Venn residence. It was adjacent to the field where John Herbst's sons were working on the day of the teenager's disappearance. As the area was filled with large tree stumps, locals began investigating them as they passed. One charred stump in particular, about 9 foot high with a 16-inch wide hollow in the center, was examined and revealed the body of Chrissy Venn. She had been stuffed head first inside the stump. Beneath Chrissy's body lay the basket she had left home with that day, along with her handkerchief, a bottle which had originally been inside the basket, a cap, and her underwear. Money which had been given to her by her mother the day she disappeared was missing. Twisted around the teenager's neck was a piece of hay baling wire about 1 foot in length. Before I continue, I want to remind you that only a small percentage of people who watch my videos are actually subscribed. So if you enjoy my content, consider subscribing. It's free and you can always change your mind later. Now let's move on with the video. Part of her dress had been torn off and stuffed down her throat. The medical examiner determined that Chrissy had died due to suffocation and noted that it appeared she had been sexually assaulted as semen was found inside her body. It was clear that the 13-year-old had fought ferociously both from the evidence on her body and that which was available at the crime scene, which was established as being 12 yards from the tree stump. At the crime scene, investigators recovered a significant amount of evidence, including safety pins, a piece of wire, a blood-stained stick, and bloodied pieces of cotton fabric, believed to have been used as a makeshift sanitary pad. It was soon determined that some of the wire found at the scene had been cut from a nearby gate leading into John Herbst's fields. Not long after, authorities identified their prime suspect, George William King, a 36-year-old local farm worker who was married with children. King was acquainted with both Chrissy and her mother, having visited their home on multiple occasions, often staying late into the evening. Though King had participated in the search efforts for Chrissy, he was notably absent from the group that ultimately discovered her body. Several individuals observed that he had deep cuts and scratches on his hands, injuries police found particularly suspicious. One wound was reportedly infected and visibly festering. According to multiple witnesses, Chrissy had become frightened of King in the weeks leading up to her death, often hiding in nearby brush when she saw him approaching. When questioned, King claimed he had no idea why the young girl would react to him that way. However, police only grew more weary of him the more they spoke with him, as the 36-year-old changed the details of his alibi on several different occasions. An inquest into Chrissy's demise found that she was willfully murdered by some person or persons unknown. The jury added, "We are of the opinion that the weight of evidence is sufficiently strong against the accused George William King to warrant his committal for trial." King's trial began on August 14 and concluded 1 week later when he was found not guilty and acquitted of all charges. Afterwards, the lead detective on Chrissy's case was fired for incompetence, as he'd reportedly failed to interview other persons of interest, focusing only on the farm worker. The coroner also suffered following the end of the trial. He had failed to collect and preserve key pieces of evidence between Chrissy's death in February and the trial in August, and had changed his findings so many times that his testimony became unreliable. According to the Examiner in March of 1921, King had received an anonymous and signed letter that was crudely written with an equally crude representation of a man hanging by the neck from the gallows. The letter read, "Take care. I saw you murder Chrissy then, and if you don't confess, I'm going to tell the police." Despite the efforts of law enforcement, the letter writer was never identified. After King's acquittal, Chrissy's case grew cold. In recent years, online sleuths have found newspaper clippings showing that Chrissy was raped in 1917 when she was just 10 years old. Frustratingly, the culprit was acquitted of all charges, and once again, there was no justice for the young girl. Chrissy's family life appeared to be rather a strange one. Her mother-born Eva Mae Chilcott married Chrissy's father, George Arthur Van, in 1906. Reportedly, Eva was 24 and George was 18. The couple had Chrissy in 1907 and a son 1 year later. Although it's unclear what became of him, as there are almost no mentions of him in articles about Chrissy's case. Eva later claimed that George had drowned at sea but gave varying accounts of the exact circumstances of his death. Once even claiming that he died in 1902, which would have made him 13, and would have made it very difficult for them to have married 4 years later and had children. One researcher found that George was actually alive as late as 1917 and suspects that the couple never actually lived together. A man of the same name lived in Somerset and Queensland during the years Eva was married. Stranger still, 2 days before Chrissy's murder, a woman named Edith Revel, who was married to George Ven's cousin, took her own life. She was found drowned in East Overstone Beach on February 24th. Her handbag was also found, and inside it contained a letter addressed to farmer and landowner John Herbst. A segment of the letter said, "Don't go to Jim, he's in trouble. Do what you can to comfort him. I must go." Additionally, Edith wrote in a separate note that she, quote, "made my will and left it with Mrs. Chilcott." It remains uncertain whether the woman referred to as Mrs. Chilcott was actually Chrissy's mother, who at the time would have been known as Mrs. Dawes, though the similarity raises eyebrows as a possible coincidence. Another curious detail is the connection between Edith and her husband James Venn with John Herbst. Though the nature of their relationship and the trouble James may have been facing at the time Edith wrote her letter remains unclear. The reasons behind Edith's decision to take her own life are also unknown. No additional suspects were ever identified in Chrissy Venn's case. In more recent years, some have speculated that Chrissy's murder may be linked to the case of Alma Turchk, a young girl who was strangled in Melbourne in December 1921. Although a man was convicted and executed for Alma's death, forensic evidence later cleared him, and he was formally pardoned in February 2008. As of today, both Chrissy Ven's and Alma Turchka's murders remain officially unsolved. Melissa Jean Allen Avila. In 1987, a 19-year-old woman found herself pregnant, a life-changing event that is typically filled with joy but was shrouded in ambiguity. Little is known about her circumstances during this time, leaving critical questions unanswered. Was the pregnancy the result of a relationship, or were there more complex and troubling factors involved? The absence of information only deepened the air of mystery and sorrow surrounding what was to come. In October 1987, a man searching through a dumpster for recyclables behind a business on the 5400 block of La Sierra Avenue in Riverside, California, made a chilling discovery. Among the refuse lay the lifeless body of a newborn baby girl. The Riverside County Coroner's Office quickly concluded that the baby's life had been deliberately taken. Despite their relentless efforts, detectives from the Riverside Police Department reached a dead end. They pursued every lead, conducted interviews, and combed through potential evidence, but the identities of the baby's mother or anyone involved remained a mystery. As time passed, the case grew cold, overshadowed by the passage of decades. However, in 2020, the Riverside Police Department's Cold Case Unit made a critical decision to revisit this tragic case, reigniting the hope for answers long overdue. One that would eventually lead to justice for a crime that had been unsolved for over 3 decades. Determined to resolve the case of the unidentified baby girl found in 1987, detectives joined forces with the Riverside County Regional Cold Case Team and the non-profit organization Season of Justice. This collaboration was driven by the hope that new forensic technologies, especially advanced DNA analysis, could finally identify the mother of the deceased infant. Their dedication paid off when the DNA evidence eventually led them to a name: Melissa Jean Allen Avila. After years of uncertainty, the mother of the baby was finally identified, but the case was far from over. Authorities needed to locate Avila, who had since moved across the country. On August 7, 2024, the long search came to an end when Avila, now a 55-year-old resident of Shelby, North Carolina, was apprehended. Her arrest was the result of coordinated efforts between the U.S. Marshals Pacific Southwest Regional Fugitive Task Force and the U.S. Marshals Carolinas Regional Fugitive Task Force. Following her arrest, Avila was extradited back to Riverside County, California, the place where the tragic events of 1987 had unfolded. She now faced charges for taking the life of her newborn baby girl. Avila, now confronting the long-overdue reckoning for her actions, was booked into the Larry D. Smith Correctional Facility. This marked a dramatic departure from the years of freedom she had enjoyed, despite the haunting truth of her past. With bail set at $1,100,000, the gravity of the charges against her was evident. The court is set to review the evidence linking Avila to the tragic death of her newborn daughter, with DNA analysis serving as a cornerstone of the prosecution's case. Moving on to the next case. Jason Anthony Jalkowski. In February, Jason Jalkowski, a teenage boy, vanished on his way to work, never to be heard from again. Despite years of investigation, no clues, physical evidence, or any insight into his disappearance have emerged. As a result, his case has become one of the most perplexing and eerie mysteries in Nebraska's history. Jason Anthony Jalkowski was born on June 24, 1981, in Grand Island, Nebraska, the eldest of 2 sons born to Kelly Murphy and Jim Jalkowski. He had a relatively normal and happy childhood. While Jason dealt with a mild learning disability affecting his speech and language, he was still regarded as exceptionally intelligent. He graduated from Benson High School in Omaha and continued his education at Iowa Western Community College in Council Bluffs. Jason had dreams of becoming a DJ after completing his studies and was enrolled in the radio broadcasting program as a part-time student. To support himself, he worked part-time at Fazoli's, an Italian-American restaurant on 80th and Cass Streets in Omaha. His mother described him as shy and quiet, with only a small group of friends. Despite his reserved nature, she highlighted that he was remarkably polite and always willing to help others. Jason was last seen on June 13, 2001. Since it was the summer holidays, he and his 13-year-old brother, Michael, were left home alone while their parents went to work. That morning, Jason received a call from his boss asking him to come in early. Jason agreed, but his car was in the shop, so his boss suggested that he send one of his co-workers to pick him up. They arranged to meet at 11 a.m. at his old high school's parking lot as Jason could walk there easily. For the next short while, Jason finished up some chores and prepared to head to work. A neighbor spotted him at 10:45 a.m. helping Michael bring in the empty bins from the side of the road and put them back in their garage. He then set off from his home in the area of 48th and Bedford Streets in the direction of Benson High. Jason's disappearance quickly became apparent when he failed to meet a coworker at 11 a.m. Concerned, the coworker called his house between 11:15 and 11:30 to inquire about his whereabouts. Since then, Jason has not been seen or heard from again. His parents, under the mistaken belief that they had to wait 24 hours before reporting a missing person, didn't contact the authorities until the following morning. Initially, investigators assumed Jason had run away, possibly acting out in a teenage rebellion, and would return when he felt ready. This assumption led to a delay in the investigation, with authorities not beginning their search until 10 days after Jason was last seen. Once the investigation started, law enforcement interviewed neighbors and conducted ground searches, but no evidence surfaced. CCTV footage from around the school showed that Jason never arrived at Benson High, despite having only a 7-block walk from his house. The area he would have traversed was quiet, with little traffic. In addition, Jason's bank account, which contained $650, remained untouched. Similarly, he has not cashed any of his paychecks. His debit card hasn't been used. His mobile phone hasn't been touched. He never picked up his car from the garage. His parents noted that he was due to start a new job the week after he went missing and that he was very much looking forward to it. He had been in good spirits and was not involved with anyone romantically at the time he went missing. He did not do drugs or drink alcohol and has no history of running away. He also has no known enemies. When he left the house on June 13, 2001, he carried no more than $60 on him and had left behind his clothing and other effects, though he was known to have his red work t-shirt with him. All in all, there were no signs that Jason planned to leave, and his parents believed that he was too responsible to have left without telling anyone. A friend of his echoed similar sentiments when she reported, "He loves his parents and his brother more than anything in the world. He'd be talking to me on the phone, and he'd put me on hold so that he could tuck his brother into bed. His family came first." Both authorities and Jason's family believe that he met with foul play on the day of his disappearance. Amateur sleuths have suggested that he was picked up by somebody he knew or lured inside a home, since CCTV showed that he never made it to the school, suggesting he was interrupted while walking there. Others have theorized his body was disposed of following a hit and run, or that he was approached for help by a neighbor with sinister intentions. Unfortunately, though, there are simply no clues in the case to indicate what became of the 19-year-old. In February 2007, Jason's mother quoted an unnamed police sergeant who called the disappearance the most baffling case he has seen in 30 years. Jason's parents, Jim and Kelly, created a non-profit organization named Project Jason in the aftermath of their son's disappearance. The organization aims to provide assistance to the families of the missing. Similarly, they lobby for Jason's Law, which was passed by the Nebraska legislature in February 2005. The law birthed the creation of a statewide database for missing people. Kelly later received a Volunteer for Victims Award in 2010 and the Nebraska Governor's Points of Light Award in 2014, both in recognition for the work she has done to help support the families of missing people. As of 2024, Jason's case remains open and is still being investigated by Omaha PD, but there have been no new leads in the last 23 years. Friends and family marked the 20th anniversary of his disappearance in 2021 by gathering at a park. Kelly stated, "Unfortunately, with this mark, I will not have had him more years than I had him in my life since he disappeared at the age of 19. He was almost 20, but he was 19. That's hard to fathom. 20 years. That's 2 decades. She recalled one of the last times she spent time with him when they had supper with the rest of the family. We didn't really have a name for it, but it was a kind of who laughs first game. You'd say one word, usually something silly, and the goal was to see who would start laughing first. He always lost, as we knew he had a tendency to start giggling." 19-year-old Jason was last seen on June 13, 2001, when he left his home near 48th and Bedford Streets in Omaha, Nebraska. He is described as a white male with brown hair and brown eyes, standing 6 feet 1 inch tall and weighing 160 pounds at the time of his disappearance. When last seen, he was wearing a white Chicago Cubs or Sammy Sosa t-shirt, a blue or black Chicago Cubs baseball cap, black dress trousers, and black dress shoes. He was also carrying his red work t-shirt. His speech and language disability may have made him seem more vulnerable than he was, and he was known by the nickname JJ. If Jason is still alive, he would be 43 this year. Anyone with information about his disappearance is urged to contact the Omaha Police Department at 402-444-5657. Moving on to the next case. Kathy Ornette Hicks. In 1982, 25-year-old Kathy Ornette Hicks lived in Atlanta, Georgia, where she worked for Delta Airlines. In September, she traveled to Hawaii for a company softball tournament and was staying at the Iwekai Hotel. Kathy was last seen by her coworkers at 1:30 a.m. on September 19th. Kathy was seen with a man named Tommy, and according to her coworkers, the two took an elevator ride from the 24th floor to the hotel lobby. They then made their way toward the pool area, while Kathy's friends went to a nearby club. Later that day, at around 10 a.m., two joggers discovered a woman's body near a water reserve not far from the hotel. The body was quickly identified as Kathy Hicks. Kathy had been strangled, prompting an investigation by the Honolulu Police Department. DNA found on Kathy's underwear, which belonged to a male, was collected and stored for future use as DNA analysis techniques advanced. Additionally, a sketch was created based on witness descriptions of the man Kathy was last seen with. A co-worker of Kathy also told investigators that the man said he was a Navy sailor and had been in Hawaii for about 2 years, and that he was a native of Tuskegee, Alabama, and lived in Jacksonville, Florida before moving to Hawaii. No witnesses to the crime came forward and police did not find any other useful leads, so the case went cold. Then, in February 2019, the solving of an entirely different cold case would lead to the suspect in Kathy's case. Investigators tested DNA found at the crime scene of Pamela Cajanez and found that 61-year-old Thomas Lewis Garner is responsible for taking her life. Thereafter, in 2021, they found that his DNA also matched the DNA found on Kathy Hicks' underwear. Thomas worked as a dental hygienist in Jacksonville, Florida. He was also a veteran. In June of 2021, he was given a life sentence for what he did to Pamela, and investigators are sure he'll soon be convicted for taking Kathy's life. Attorney Megan Cowell said that it is vital that he should be prosecuted, already sentenced to life in prison. It's justice for the victim and the victim's family. Bringing a prosecution on behalf of the victim's family often makes you feel like justice has prevailed. Let's say, for example, the Florida Supreme Court overrules the conviction for some reason and dismisses the case. Now, if the government doesn't bring this case against the same suspect, the suspect will be let out into the community and could and probably would reoffend. DNA is extremely helpful because we can rely on the science. So now we can identify the perpetrator, we can prosecute the perpetrator, and hopefully convict the perpetrator. I'm sure many of you also now want to hear more about the Pamela Caines case, so here it is in a nutshell. Pamela grew up in Stillwater, Minnesota. In 1984, 25-year-old Pamela enlisted in the Navy. In May of that year, she left behind her family and flew across the country to Orlando, Florida, to begin training at the Orlando Naval Training Center. Sadly, Pamela never had the chance to see her dreams come true. 2 days after her graduation in August 1984, her lifeless body was discovered in front of a vacant home in Sanford, Florida. She had been assaulted and strangled. Investigators were able to collect DNA belonging to an unknown man from her body. In February 2005, investigators unsuccessfully attempted to find a DNA match to Pamela's attacker. In 2015, investigators finally got a break. DNA from Pamela's clothing was submitted to a private forensic genealogy service. Investigators were able to access DNA profiles of individuals who submitted their DNA to genealogy websites. They found a match to a distant relative of Pamela's attacker. Investigators began to build a family tree that would eventually lead them to Thomas Garner, as we already know. Investigators had to make sure they had the right guy, so they then collected a cigarette that he had smoked. The DNA samples collected were a match to the skin found under Pamela's fingernails. Her family was relieved and overjoyed when investigators informed them of the arrest and subsequent conviction of the perpetrator. Moving on to the next case. Danielle Houchins. Danielle Houchins, born in 1981 to her mother Cheryl Houchins, was lovingly called Danny. From an early age, she was the center of her mother's world, and their bond was incredibly strong. On September 21, 1996, 15-year-old Danielle left her home in Belgrade, Montana, planning to spend the day fishing at Cameron Bridge Fishing Access, a favorite spot she often visited. It was meant to be a peaceful and solitary retreat, just another quiet day by the water. But what started as a simple outing turned into a chilling mystery when Danielle failed to come home. Later that day, searchers found her truck parked near the fishing access point. The vehicle was unlocked with no immediate signs of a struggle. However, there was no sign of Danielle. As hours passed and daylight began to fade, the search efforts grew more frantic, fueled by mounting concerns for her well-being. Tragically, those concerns were confirmed when Danielle's lifeless body was discovered several hours later, face down in shallow water not far from where her truck was found. The evidence of assault was unmistakable, and the circumstances of her death were both brutal and devastating. Her attacker had cruelly forced her head into the marshy ground, suffocating her as she choked on the mud. Investigators worked to piece together the events leading to her tragic end. But one haunting question remained: who was responsible for taking Danielle Houchins' life? For nearly 28 years, the mystery surrounding Danielle's death remained unsolved. Though the case had gone cold, the sheriff's office refused to let it fade into obscurity. In February 2019, they reopened the investigation, hopeful that advances in forensic science could finally provide answers. Preserved evidence from Danielle's case was sent to a cutting-edge forensic lab in California for meticulous analysis. The DNA was then compared against the FBI's CODIS database, but no matches were identified. While this outcome was disheartening, investigators remained determined in their quest for justice. They turned to a groundbreaking technique, genetic genealogy. With a court order, they accessed extensive DNA databases, hoping to find a connection that CODIS had missed. This innovative approach proved successful, leading them to Paul Hutchinson, a 55-year-old man living in Dillon, Montana. In July 2024, investigators visited Hutchinson at his home and confronted him with questions about Danielle's case. The encounter was fraught with tension, and Hutchinson's nervous, erratic behavior only fueled suspicions. His demeanor suggested he was concealing something far darker than anticipated. Just hours after the interview, on August 9, 2024, Hutchinson took his own life, abruptly ending any chance of a full confession. Despite his sudden death, the case was far from over. Not long after, forensic analysts confirmed that the DNA evidence from Danielle's case was a definitive match to Paul Hutchinson. While this long-awaited breakthrough brought a sense of relief, it was accompanied by profound sorrow. Hutchinson's family, unaware of his past, was left shattered by the revelation. A longtime employee of the Bureau of Land Management, Hutchinson had been married for 22 years and was the father of two, a daughter in her early 20s and a younger son. At the time of Danielle's murder, Hutchinson was a graduate student at Montana State and had only been in the area briefly. While the confirmation of his guilt offered some closure to Danielle's family, it also highlighted the deep scars left by a crime that had remained unresolved for so many years. Danielle's younger sister, Stephanie Mallet, expressed mixed emotions saying, "Even though this man will not face a jury of his peers, I have no doubt he was the one who violently assaulted my sister. When the moment came to take responsibility for his actions, he chose instead to end his life. He knew his guilt and could not face my family, his own family, or the immense pain he caused." After nearly 28 years of unanswered questions and delayed justice, Stephanie reflected on the long struggle. 28 years is far too long, she said. I had to fight far too hard to find justice for my 15-year-old sister. Montanans, Danielle's story should outrage you. It should make you think about your mothers, your sisters, your wives, and your daughters. It should make you consider everything you would do to protect and honor the women you love. Paul Hutchinson's wife, Christy, released a statement in response to the shocking discovery saying, "We are absolutely heartbroken to learn this news. Our hearts go out to the Hutchins family." Christy said, "It brings some comfort to know that they can finally find the closure they have long deserved. For our own family, however, this has been an incredibly difficult time. We were already grappling with the pain of Paul taking his own life. In 24 years of marriage, there was never any indication that something like this could be part of his past. Paul was an extraordinary husband and father." She continued, "This latest revelation has made our grief even more complicated. We kindly ask for the space to process this devastating news and come to terms with it as we mourn." With the confirmation of Paul Hutchinson's guilt, the investigation into Danielle's case has officially been closed. However, law enforcement remains committed to examining Hutchinson's life for any potential links to other unsolved cases. The two teens. In the 1960s and 1970s, two teenagers were brutally murdered and their killers seemed to have vanished without a trace. However, nearly 60 years later, detectives were able to link the crimes through DNA, finally identifying the faceless monster responsible for their deaths. Diane Alquitz, 19, was killed in 1966, and Terry Lee Erdman, 15, lost his life in 1971. Both were taken mercilessly from their families, just 5 years apart and only 2 miles from each other. Many years later, the truth was unearthed, literally, when authorities exhumed the killer's remains to collect DNA. Diane Alkiewicz, the fourth child of a Catholic family with 6 children, was born in 1947 in Menominee Falls, Wisconsin. The bustling household was located on Hayes Avenue, just a block from St. Mary Catholic Church, where they attended services. Diane was cherished by her older siblings, Dennis, Edward, and Nancy, and equally loved by her younger sisters, Patty and Debbie. Diane was the epitome of a middle child, loving, caring, and always looking out for others. She was sensitive yet outgoing, always eager to be social and involved. Tall and slender, with dark brown hair and a quick sense of humor, Diane's bright smile was her trademark. By the time she graduated high school, she had blossomed into a graceful, charming young woman. Regular visits to St. Mary's Church were a part of her life, offering her peace and guidance. Whenever she encountered difficulties or doubts, Diane found solace in prayer, relying on her faith for comfort. When it came to relationships, she was sincere and genuine. Though she dated casually in high school and had a few steady boyfriends, it wasn't until after graduation that she met someone who sparked a deeper connection. Her romance with Donald Heilmeyer from Milwaukee eventually led to an engagement. As she transitioned into adulthood, Diane chose a path that was typical for many young women of that time, full of hope and ambition. Securing a secretarial position at Kenworth Manufacturing, she had a diligent work ethic. After a year of employment, Diane felt ready to take the next step in her journey. It was time to fly the coop, so to speak. With her brother Edward's girlfriend as her roommate, Diane moved into her own apartment on Hoyt Drive. Amidst the changes and milestones in her life, Diane stood by her dear friend Diane Zimmer, as she chose another path and got married. Zimmer and Diane had been in the same school since elementary school but became best friends in freshman year. Serving as maid of honor at Zimmer's wedding, who married her longtime high school sweetheart, marked yet another chapter in their shared history. Her fiancé, Donald Hurlmeyer, attended as her plus one. Shortly after, Donald left for basic training at Fort Hood, Texas, as he had been drafted into the Army. Diane felt a deep sense of loneliness without him by her side. To fill the void left by his absence, she sought out activities to occupy her time and distract her from the ache in her heart. In the evenings, Diane enrolled in swimming and knitting classes, embracing the opportunity to learn new skills and engage in social interactions. Additionally, she took on a part-time job as a hostess at the local Dutchland dairy restaurant, eagerly immersing herself in the bustling atmosphere to pass the hours. On November 3, 1966, Diane went about her day as usual. Patty, her younger sister, vividly recalls reaching out to Diane in hopes of borrowing a blue mohair sweater for a sleepover plan that night. Without hesitation, Diane generously agreed, promising to leave the sweater outside her apartment door for Patty to collect. Diane worked at 13700 block of West Silver Spring Drive at the metal stamping plant of Kenworth Manufacturing Company. By now, she had worked at the company for a year and a half, marking 18 months with them. She was dedicated. That day, the building was busy with activity as 25 factory workers carried out their weekend shifts, which concluded promptly at 3:30 p.m. Amidst the industrious setting, Diane stood out as the sole secretary. She was responsible for managing communications and coordinating deliveries. After the factory workers left for the day, Diane remained behind, working away at her desk until 4:30 p.m. Her duties extended beyond the typical work hours as she dutifully fielded phone calls and accepted late deliveries. Following her shift, Diane would typically rendezvous with her best friend Zimmer at her nearby workplace. Together, they would head home, sharing laughter and companionship along the way. However, that day something was definitely off. Diane was unusually late in picking up Zimmer, worrying for those who knew her well. In response, Zimmer accepted a ride with her employer's wife who offered to take her to Kenworth to investigate. Upon arriving at the factory, they were confused. Diane's car sat in the parking lot, seemingly undisturbed. Peering through the window into the plant, they spotted Diane's purse resting on a desk and her coat hanging near the closet. Yet Diane herself was nowhere to be found. To add to the mystery, all the doors were securely locked, leaving no clues as to Diane's whereabouts. Maybe she was in the bathroom. Dennis, her brother, worked in the plant next door, so Zimmer and the boss's wife walked over to him. The trio returned just in time for the supervisor to show up for some after-hour tasks. He came to unlock the shipping room around 5:20 p.m., and that is when they saw all the blood. 20 feet from the door was the lifeless body of Diane, face down on the floor in her own blood. She had been stabbed so many times. Her knit dress was pulled up around her legs and hanging loosely off her shoulders, but her underwear remained untouched. At first, the officers believed there had been no sexual assault. There were no signs of violence or aggression in her private areas, but the medical examiner's report told a different story. The autopsy revealed that Diane had been stabbed 106 times with a knife, likely with a 3-inch blade featuring one sharp, serrated edge. The wounds ranged from half an inch to 3/4 of an inch wide, with depths of 2 to 3 inches. It was clear that Diane had fought back, as there were defensive wounds on her arms and the backs of her hands. Her nose had been broken, and there were 30 stab wounds to her head, neck, and face. Additionally, 35 stab wounds were found in rows along her back, where she had been repeatedly stabbed while lying on her stomach. Diane's brutal murder rocked the once peaceful village of Menominee Falls, leaving its residents stunned and horrified. Such a violent act was unprecedented in the village's history. It was the first recorded slaying in the serene community at the northwestern city limits of Milwaukee. Just months prior to Diane's untimely tragedy, the slaying of a 10-year-old girl in Milwaukee had cast a shadow of fear of the region. Debbie, her younger sister, was scared because the girl was so close to Debbie in age. But Diane, with a reassuring smile, had said, "We are fine. We live in Menominee Falls." In the aftermath of Diane's attack, the town changed forever. Fear gripped the hearts of residents. They bought guard dogs, chain locks, and firearms as they struggled with the new feeling of vulnerability in their once safe town. At Diane's funeral mass held at St. Mary's, grief hung heavy in the air as 250 mourners, including her devastated fiancé Donald Hillemeyer, gathered to bid farewell. Donald, granted emergency leave from basic training, was still reeling from the shock of the tragic loss. In an attempt to catch the perpetrator as soon as possible, Diane's friends, family, and acquaintances were questioned on the night her body was recovered. Patrolman Dan Schroem's first year as a police officer started off with something huge. He was assigned to remain at the site of the crime to overlook comings and goings. As spooked as he was, there was nothing to fear. Nobody came to look at things again. He would retire as a captain 26 years later, But nothing could match the horrors of the Diane Olkwich case. The investigation into Diane's slaying unfolded to give a better picture of the events leading to her tragic demise. Police surmised that the assailant ambushed Diane as she prepared to lock up and leave for the day, catching her off guard when she was all alone after hours. Their suspicions deepened as they contemplated the intruder's familiarity with the layout of the plant. It suggested that there was planning involved in targeting Diane. Then Chief of the Menominee Falls Police Department, Charles Kuhn, offered a sobering deduction, saying that Diane's assailant was not a faceless stranger, but rather someone she knew. This unsettling revelation cast a shadow of suspicion over friends, acquaintances, and associates, heightening the sense of unease within the tight-knit community. A team of dedicated detectives committed themselves to working day and night. The 7 detectives worked tirelessly through grueling 12 to 16-hour shifts without rest. Over 100 crucial pieces of evidence, including fingerprints retrieved from the crime scene and Diane's blood-stained garments, were meticulously cataloged and dispatched to the FBI headquarters in Washington, D.C. In the ensuing weeks, law enforcement officers interrogated all possible leads. They conducted over 500 interviews in search of the truth. Despite their exhaustive efforts, their pursuit was fruitless. Initially, 6 people were marked as potential suspects, each with solid alibis firmly in place. Diane's family and close confidants steered investigators towards a troubling figure lurking at her workplace. The son of her boss, whose persistent advances had made her incredibly uncomfortable. She was almost afraid of him. Recounting Diane's hesitance, her sister Patty vividly recalled her distressing encounters with the unwanted suitor. He knew she was committed, but that did not stop him. Yet even as suspicion swirled around the employer's son, he had a steadfast alibi, corroborated by family members. As the trail of leads grew cold and the promise of breakthroughs faded, the investigation lost its momentum. With each passing day, Diane's unsolved case went cold. Donald Hurlmeyer, her fiancé, returned to basic training heartbroken with questions that would never be answered. Diane's parents both passed young, their health deteriorating under the strain of their daughter's slaying. Her mother Irene had been diagnosed with diabetes shortly before the terrible night she lost her daughter. She passed away of congestive heart failure at 50 years old in 1973. One would say she could not bear losing her daughter. Her father, Robert, suffered a heart attack at 55, 3 years later. Diane's eldest sister, Nancy, passed at 58, and her brother, Dennis, who tirelessly pursued justice for Diane, suffered a stroke at 50, and he too was lost 12 years later. In 1966, Menominee Falls Police sent a questionnaire to delivery companies that had contacts with Kenworth. Company records show that your company makes deliveries here, and we request your cooperation in answering the following questions and returning this paper to our department immediately. Your cooperation will be of vital assistance in solving this crime. One company responded, saying the man picked something up from Kenworth 4 days before the tragedy. The man would have been familiar with the scene of the Diane Olkwich case. It is unclear whether this lead was pursued. In the 1990s, DNA technology raised hopes for solving Diane's case. Despite entering evidence into Cody's and pursuing suspects for DNA samples, no matches were found. The prime suspect, the employer's son, had passed away in 1991, and his cremated remains could not provide a sample. Initially, detectives believed this was a position that offers no hope of progress. While the case remained open, it was simply a formality. But they did not realize the assailant was lurking nearby, looking for new prey. Terry Lee Erdman was described as a quiet, reserved girl with a great sense of humor. The middle child of 3 siblings, she had 2 brothers, Daryl and Daniel. But being the only daughter in the family, she got extra attention from her parents. Terry's father worked as a switchman for the Milwaukee Road. Their life was comfortable. Her mother, Lois May Christian, was employed in fabric stores and J.C. Penney's. She often went bowling with her husband in couples leagues. The family loved spending time together at their cottage in Tomahawk, Wisconsin. Terry had a loving family. The 15-year-old had just finished 9th grade at Samuel Morse Junior High School. She was going to enroll in James Madison High School during fall and September of 1971. On Wednesday, 23 June 1971, she left home somewhere around 5 p.m. She was going to babysit in the neighborhood. She typically left a note when she went out, and it was usually on a Wednesday. But this time she didn't. Her family thought it was just an oversight. However, by 9:30 p.m., their concern grew. They checked with neighbors and made calls, but no one had seen her. Earlier in the day, she had spent time with friends near North 95th and West Rio Streets, enjoying laughs and conversation until the sky turned purple. Harry decided to head home, choosing the familiar shortcut through the open field, a path she knew well that saved a few minutes on her walk to their house on the 10400 block of West Silver Spring Drive. That was the last time anyone knew of her whereabouts. The following day, 11-year-old Robert Sonier was walking in the woods behind the Moore Way department store on the 10100 block of West Appleton Avenue with his father, Walter. This particular area of woods was called Lover's Lane as it was secluded, and teen couples often parked their cars there to get intimate as suggested by the name. As they walked through the dense bushes, Robert saw something odd. It looked like a person lying on the ground in the thicket of trees and small grass. He first thought perhaps it was a couple, but then noticed it was a girl all alone. He realized it was a lifeless body of a girl. The 15-year-old was stabbed over 60 times. Her arms were tied with twine. Her blue shorts and underwear had been pulled down, and her jersey sweater was pulled over her face, suggesting she had been assaulted. According to Officer Robert Schultz, she had been stabbed aggressively. Late that night, around 12:30 a.m., her father was brought in to identify her body at the county morgue. Terry's 1971 case is the third oldest unsolved case at the Milwaukee Police Department. Police exhausted all possible leads, and nothing could be said about whether or not she would get justice. Her family was never the same again. In February 2011, DNA was taken from Terry's autopsy, and it was identified as male DNA. Detectives suspected the same person committed both of the slayings of Diane and Terry due to case similarities. Firstly, the distance between the cases. It happened around 1.5 miles from each other. Also, both victims were teenage girls, so it did match the profile he must have set in his mind for the ideal victim. Both of them were stabbed. It was highly aggressive, as if in a frenzy even as the life had drained from the body. Lastly, there was evidence of intimate assault, which provided a motive for such a heinous crime. A joint request was placed at the Wisconsin Crime Lab to compare the DNA profiles to each other. The Wisconsin Crime Lab then confirmed that the DNA profiles from both victims were consistent. The DNA could not be matched to a suspect, so the case went cold again. In February, Menominee Falls Detective Chris Bellows met with the staff of the State of Wisconsin Crime Laboratory about the use of forensic investigative genetic genealogy, which had been developed in February 2019. Then in February, through investigative efforts that utilized forensic investigative genetic genealogy, a potential suspect was identified. Clarence Tappendorf was a delivery driver in 1966 for Claremont Transfer Company, whose route included Kenworth. There were no deliveries scheduled on the date of Diane's demise. 4 days before her slaying, he picked up a delivery according to the questionnaires Menominee Falls PD had given out during the initial investigation. He would have basic knowledge of the layout of the building and the fact that Diane would be alone 3:30 p.m. to 4:30 p.m. On the day Diane lost her life, Tappendorf made a delivery to a location across the street from Kenworth Company. Tappendorf, a man whose life spanned 80 years, had already passed away on January 6, 2008. Investigators reached out to the late Tappendorf's 2 adult sons, and one of them agreed to provide a DNA sample. They compared his DNA to the profiles from both cases and discovered that the DNA found on Diane Alkowitz's clothing likely belonged to Tappendorf, their father. Police then obtained a search warrant to exhume Tappendorf's body from Holy Cross Cemetery in Milwaukee to collect DNA samples for further analysis. Tappendorf was a devoted husband to Joyce for 57 years, a loving father to 6 children, a grandfather to 6 grandchildren, and a great-grandfather to many. Despite his picture-perfect family life, he was confirmed as a match for the perpetrator's DNA in October 2023. At the time Diane's life was taken, he would have been 39 years old, and 44 when he attacked young Terry Lee. This revelation raises many questions, especially when considering the tragic event that later befell him. At the age of 17, Tappendorf experienced the heartbreaking loss of his own daughter. Hattie Jode Tappendorf, his daughter, was found beaten to death on a sidewalk near her home on August 1, 1975, just 2 blocks away. This occurred 4 years after Tappendorf's last known attack. The perpetrator, Roy Clark O'Neill, an 18-year-old, was identified when his parents turned him in after recognizing a watch from a television report about the crime scene. The suspect told authorities that he had taken LSD and had been drinking. He was convicted of second-degree slaying and sentenced to 38 years in prison. Then, Tappendorf's son passed away in 1987. His wife, Joyce, had to face the unbearable pain of losing a child to a violent fate all over again. On Friday, May 22, 1987, their 34-year-old son, Mark, took his own life in what police determined to be a slaying. Mark shot his wife, Linda, 34, in the head with a hunting rifle before turning the weapon on himself early Friday morning in their South Side home. The bodies were discovered by their 15-year-old daughter around 7 a.m. The couple's daughter and son had slept through the ordeal. Joyce reflected on the tragedy, struggling to comprehend why such sorrow had struck her family again. She described her son as a deeply troubled person, unable to understand why he had also taken Linda's life. But this could offer another explanation. Perhaps there was an undiagnosed illness, a mental illness for both the father and the son. Debbie Cagliari, Diane's sister, thanked the detectives for their hard work and dedication to solve Diane's case. Debbie was only 9 when her niece even appeared for an interview. She said the following to families of other cold case victims. "Do not give up. Do not give up. You cannot give up hope. You have to keep it going." Norman Gross, a former classmate of Diane's, said he never gave up hope that her perpetrator would eventually be revealed. "Just going to class reunions and stuff, her name was always there. She is always on your mind. All these years, and finally it has come to a conclusion." Attorney General Josh Cole expressed his sadness that the individual responsible for the crimes could not be brought to justice during his lifetime. However, he acknowledged the tireless efforts of investigators and scientists who worked relentlessly to identify the perpetrator, bringing some form of closure to the case. Chief Jeffrey Norman added, "I know there are families out there wondering about their cases. There is no statute of limitations on a murder investigation. Whether it's 5, 10, or 70 years, we are committed to bringing closure and resolution to these heinous crimes." Despite the years of pain and loss, the truth eventually came to light, allowing the victims' families to begin the long process of healing. While some may feel that Clarence Tappendorf got away with it, his life seems to have been marked by an eerie sense of suffering. At least with the help of DNA and genetic genealogy, the victims' families were finally able to gain some answers about the horrific crimes. As for the why, that answer remains buried with Clarence Tappendorf. Investigators are now exploring the possibility that he may be responsible for other unsolved crimes. Moving on to the next case. Karen and Gordon Alexander. On a fateful April night in 1981, in Texarkana, Arkansas, the lives of 2 innocent children, Karen and Gordon Alexander, were tragically taken within the walls of their home on Carmichael Hill. Stabbed multiple times with a butter knife, this horrifying crime would remain unsolved, casting a dark shadow over the community for over 40 years. But just when all seemed lost, forensic evidence would finally reveal the truth, leading investigators to someone they had trusted all along. Karen and Gordon grew up in the close-knit community of Texarkana during the 1970s, in a home filled with love and care from their parents, Weldon and Vera Alexander. While their father worked at Cooper Tire and Rubber, their mother dedicated herself to nurturing and supporting them. Karen, a quiet 8th grader at College Hill Elementary, was known for her shy nature and soft-spoken demeanor. She dreamt of becoming a nurse, and her gentle, compassionate personality shone through, though she kept many of her thoughts to herself. In contrast, Gordon was lively and full of energy, bringing a sense of vibrancy and joy to those around him. Despite the numerous challenges Gordon faced in his 13 years, including a congenital heart defect and open-heart surgery as an infant, he managed to maintain a bright outlook on life. Along with these hardships, Gordon suffered a stroke that left him with limited movement in his left arm and leg. Despite these setbacks, his spirit remained unbroken, and he faced life with courage and optimism. Tragically, a fall that resulted in a broken hip further complicated his life, confining him to a wheelchair as he recovered. Outwardly, the Alexander family seemed to have a picture-perfect life, with 2 children and dedicated parents. But behind the closed doors of their home, the reality was far darker than anyone could have expected. On the morning of April 8, 1981, a peaceful day in Texarkana turned into a nightmare. Weldon Alexander, the father of Karen and Gordon, returned home after his overnight shift at Cooper Tire and Rubber around 7 a.m. Upon his arrival, he noticed something unusual. The screen door and the wooden front door were both open. Stepping inside, he was met with a gruesome sight. In the kitchen, Weldon found his son Gordon lifeless on the floor. In a panic, Weldon moved through the house and discovered his daughter Karen on her bed near the living room area. She was still alive but seriously injured, suffering from multiple stab wounds. Weldon immediately called the police, who arrived to confirm the horrific scene. Gordon had already succumbed to his injuries, while Karen was in critical condition, barely clinging on to life. She was quickly transported to St. Michael Hospital, where she would tragically pass away 3 days later on April 11th, having never regained consciousness from a coma. An autopsy revealed that Karen had been assaulted in the hours leading up to her demise. Detectives noted that the weapon, a butter knife, had been left at the scene. Weldon admitted to police that he had removed the butter knife from Karen's body and placed it on a nearby bookshelf, explaining why his fingerprints were found on the weapon. After the brutal killings of Karen and Gordon Alexander, the Texarkana Police Department launched an intensive investigation. Officers thoroughly examined the Alexander home, carefully documenting the crime scene and collecting any evidence they could find. The absence of forced entry suggested that the killer was likely someone familiar to the family. Investigators conducted interviews with neighbors, friends, and family, but soon found themselves at a dead end. At the time of the crime, Weldon reported that his wife, Vera, was in a psychiatric facility, which further complicated the investigation. With no clear suspects and scant physical evidence, the case quickly went cold. However, in 1983, hope briefly resurfaced when Henry Lee Lucas, a violent felon awaiting trial in Texas, began confessing to a range of unsolved crimes across the United States. Lucas manipulated law enforcement by giving detailed, though often fabricated, accounts of various slayings, earning perks like road trips and meals in return. Among his false confessions, he claimed responsibility for the murder of Karen and Gordon, saying he had broken into their home and killed them as they slept. His confession initially seemed credible, as he had drifted through Texarkana around the time of the tragedy. But further investigation revealed that Lucas had been working in Florida at the time of the slayings, debunking his confession. Forensic evidence would later confirm that Lucas's DNA did not match the samples found at the scene, forcing detectives back to square one. The Alexander family was devastated by the loss of Karen and Gordon. A month after the tragedy, Weldon and Vera Alexander moved out of their home and relocated across town. In 1984, Vera Alexander, overwhelmed by grief, took her own life at the age of 37. Weldon Alexander would eventually remarry and have 2 more children. Decades later, the cold case was reopened in February 2023 by retired Captain Calvin Seward, who had a personal and professional connection to the original investigation. The decision came after the Facebook page Justice for Karen and Gordon Alexander gained popularity. Driven by advancements in DNA technology and a determination to find justice for the Alexander children, Seward, along with forensic criminologist Dr. Todd Steff and DNA scientist Kelly Dixon, revisited the evidence. DNA extracted from the victim's fingernail tissue revealed a familial match implicating their own father, Weldon Alexander. Further investigation showed that fibers and materials from the crime scene matched those used at Weldon's workplace. Based on the new evidence, investigators developed a theory of what they believe happened on the night of April 7, 1981. According to their reconstruction of events, Weldon Alexander had been assaulting his daughter Karen for at least 6 months before the crime. On that tragic night, he attempted to do it once again. It's believed that Gordon, Karen's brother, likely stumbled upon the attack and tried to intervene. In a fit of rage or perhaps out of desperation to silence his son, Weldon attacked Gordon first, using a butter knife as his weapon. He then turned his violent rage toward his daughter, Karen, who had managed to make it to the living room, where he launched another brutal attack. Weldon Alexander lived out the rest of his life quietly, passing away peacefully in February 2014 at the age of 80 from complications related to Alzheimer's disease. He had the luxury of living a long life, a luxury that he cruelly denied his own children. It took 42 years. But in February 2022, the tireless efforts of retired Captain Calvin Seward and his team brought the truth to light. Although Weldon never faced justice for his horrific actions, the case's resolution provided the community and surviving family members with much-needed answers and a sense of closure. Amy Milwich. Amy Milwich, known to everyone around her as a bright, adventurous girl, was full of promise. She lived in Bay Village, Ohio, a peaceful suburb on the shores of Lake Erie. Amy had a love for the natural world and a talent for athletics, making her a standout in her community. Unfortunately, her life was tragically cut short by an unsolved kidnapping and murder that left her family, friends, and the entire region in search of answers. Amy was born Amy Renee Miljevic on December 11, 1978, in Little Rock, Arkansas, to Mark and Margaret Miljevic. She had an older brother named Jason, who was 3 years her senior. In 1984, the family moved to Bay Village, Ohio, seeking a quieter and more fulfilling life in the Midwest. Bay Village, with its middle-class charm and wholesome environment, seemed like the perfect place to raise their children. It offered a sense of safety and comfort, making it an ideal community for many looking for a slice of the American dream. In Bay Village, Ohio, the community was tightly knit and trusted. The streets were considered safe, and it was common for families to keep their doors unlocked and let their children roam freely, particularly during the warm summer months. The Miljevics, new to the area, quickly embraced this lifestyle. Mark worked for General Motors, while Margaret was employed at Trading Times magazine. Their children, Jason and Amy, settled into the local school system without trouble. With a population of just 17,000, Bay Village was a peaceful and welcoming town, when newcomers were embraced with open arms. As Amy grew, she developed a wide array of interests, but none more passionate than her love for animals. Horses, in particular, captured her imagination, and she dreamed of one day owning her own or running a stable filled with her favorite breed. Her enthusiasm for animals expanded into a broader appreciation for the natural world, and Amy often ventured outdoors, exploring the town with a sense of adventure. Her vivid imagination allowed her to create stories and fantasy worlds, which she eagerly shared with others. At school, Amy's outgoing and friendly nature made her many friends, and she quickly became a beloved classmate. Amy's vibrant personality and boundless energy made her a magnetic presence among her peers. She thrived in social environments, always sharing her excitement and curiosity with those around her. Academically, she excelled, following in her brother's footsteps with a natural aptitude for learning. When she wasn't studying, Amy participated in various athletic activities, especially swimming, which she pursued with dedication. She approached life with an adventurous spirit, eager to try anything that came her way. Her father, Mark, once remarked that Amy was the type of child who would push away help just to figure things out on her own, whether it was learning how to tie her shoes or tackling any challenge life presented. Despite her outgoing nature, Amy was somewhat reserved when it came to interacting with adults. While she had a close bond with her mother, Margaret, and would engage politely with others, she didn't seek out conversations with adults outside of her immediate family and school. This reserved attitude only added to the mystery and tragedy when her life took a dark turn. In the months leading up to her death, the once peaceful and trusting Bay Village would be consumed by fear. A series of phone calls, an abduction, and the unfolding of a sinister plot would tear apart the close-knit community, leaving residents reeling from the unimaginable. The following timeline will delve into the events that ultimately led to Amy's tragic death. In the days leading up to October 27, 1989, Amy received a mysterious phone call from an unknown man who told her that her mother, Margaret, had been promoted at work. The caller then suggested they meet at a shopping center near Bay Village Middle School to discuss this promotion. Amy, believing the call to be innocent and a kind gesture for her mother, casually shared the news with a few close friends at school. However, she didn't mention the phone call to her parents and acted normally at home. On the morning of Friday, October 27th, Amy woke up early, excited for the weekend ahead. She told her mother she would be staying late after school for a 5th-grade choir audition, and as usual, she left for school on her bicycle at around 7:20 a.m. Her brother Jason had already left before her, so Amy was alone on her ride. Throughout the school day, from the time classes began until dismissal at 2:04 p.m., Amy seemed perfectly normal, displaying no signs of distress or worry. Before I continue, I want to remind you that only a small percentage of people who watch my videos are actually subscribed. So if you enjoy my content, consider subscribing. It's free and you can always change your mind later. Now let's move on with the video. 11 minutes pass by and Amy walks down the street from the middle school to the shopping center on the corner of Wolf Road and Dover Center. Ironically, just across the street from the local police department. At 2:15 p.m., Amy is seen in the shopping center plaza by fellow classmates, who are all hanging around in after-school recreational tradition. Somewhere between 2:20 and 2:30 p.m., Amy is approached by an adult white male of about 30 years, standing around 5'9" and sporting brown hair. This is the last confirmed sighting of Amy, as she is abducted and disappears from plain sight along with the adult's male figure. 40 minutes later, following the family rule that required the children to call Margaret when they returned home from school, Jason phoned his mother at 3:14 p.m. to inform her that Amy hadn't come home yet. This was unusual, as Amy always returned by 3 p.m. Margaret reassured Jason that Amy was likely still at her choir audition, but she couldn't shake the growing concern. At 3:30 p.m., Jason called again to say that Amy still hadn't arrived. Margaret's worry increased. But just as she was about to gather her things to head to work, she received another call from Amy. Margaret asked how the audition had gone, and Amy replied simply, "Okay." Margaret then asked how Amy was doing, and Amy answered, "Fine." The conversation was brief, but with no cause for alarm, Margaret resumed preparing for work, assuming her daughter was home and safe. This would be the last confirmed communication anyone had with Amy. As the hours passed, an unsettling feeling lingered in Margaret's heart. She recalled the strangely short responses from Amy, which was out of character for her typically talkative daughter. Trusting her instincts, Margaret quickly packed up and rushed out to her car. At around 5:30 p.m., she arrived home to find Amy still missing. Without hesitation, Margaret began calling Amy's friends and neighbors, desperately seeking any information or sightings. Unable to locate her, Margaret hops in the car and retraces her daughter's steps from earlier that day, leading her back to the Bay Village Middle School, where she finds Amy's bicycle still chained to the bike rack outside the building. At 5:58 p.m., Margaret takes matters out of her own hands and visits the Bay Village Police Department reporting Amy missing. A couple of officers take notes, ask questions, and put out a bulletin to alert other authorities of the issue. By 7 p.m. that evening, Mark returns home from General Motors and aids in the search for his daughter. Joining him are countless Bay Village citizens forming search parties and canvassing the streets of their once innocent little lake town. 2 hours later, at 9 p.m., the Bay Village Police Department, BVPD, became the hub for one of the most rapidly organized volunteer search efforts in Northern Ohio's history. Early the next morning at 7:10 a.m. on Saturday, October 28th, the FBI arrived in Bay Village to assist in the investigation. Special Agent Dick Wren, a Bay Village resident with strong community ties, led the investigation. By the end of the morning, Wren and the local police learned from one of Amy's schoolmates about her phone conversations with an unidentified man. It became clear to investigators that the abduction was not a random act but rather a carefully planned event. The schoolmate revealed that the man had known Amy's phone numbers, her home address, her mother's employer, and even the time she would be coming home. He was familiar with the area and was able to earn the trust of even the most cautious children. This was no random kidnapping. The man responsible was highly calculated and dangerous. As night fell on Saturday, October 28th, longtime Bay Village resident Howard Kimball took charge of the volunteer search efforts, setting up his own command post above City Hall and managing calls and tips from the community. The search quickly grew into the largest organized effort in Ohio since the 1951 disappearance of Beverly Potts. As the weekend came to an end, investigators grew increasingly concerned that their prime window of opportunity was closing. In cases of missing children, the initial hours are the most critical, and without any concrete evidence, authorities feared that the worst was yet to come. Over the next 100 days, nothing of use is uncovered. Amy's profile is shared about the world across multiple television programs and in various platforms, and yet no one comes forward with anything of substance. The next big find wouldn't come until the early morning hours of Thursday, February 8, 1990, and the worst possible scenario unfolds. At around 7 a.m., a female jogger running alongside County Road 1181 in New London of rural Ashland County, Ohio notices what appears to be a body or a lump of clothes resting in a field near her pathway. Authorities are called and quickly respond only to discover the body belongs to Amy Miljevic in a spot nearly 50 miles from where she was last seen 3.5 months prior. Near the crime scene are a blanket and shower curtain covered in Amy's family dark hair. By 1:40 p.m. later that afternoon, Amy's body undergoes an autopsy by the coroner. The coroner rules Amy's death a clear homicide via multiple stab wounds to the neck and blunt force trauma to the head. They also discover Amy had at least one meal before her death, which most likely occurred only days after her abduction. Of all the mysteries presented by the discovery of Amy's body, one thing remains certain. An innocent young girl was murdered in cold blood and a killer is on the loose. For the next 3 decades, a massive manhunt for the Lake Erie murderer burns on, led by Bay Village detectives and the FBI. In February 6th, law enforcement learns that a few other girls in the city of Northern Olmsted, Ohio received similar calls from an unidentified male figure at around the time Amy received hers, or similar setups to the one that led to Amy's abduction. None of these girls had gone through with the scheme. However, it signals to police that they are dealing with a serial predator rather than a one-off criminal. After another 7 years of inconclusive investigating, the case brings aboard Special Agent Phil Torsney, known for his role in capturing the infamous gangster. Whitey Bulgran tells reporters the killer was most a long-time resident of northern Ohio with in-depth knowledge of the local geography. Fast forward another 7 years to present day, and authorities are still without any luck or noteworthy leads in 2020. Last year, investigators claimed that whoever is responsible is most likely not even on their list of suspects at this point due to how exhaustively thorough they've been looking into the names they've come up with. Over 15,000 interviews, 150 suspects and 8,000 clues later, and Amy's death is still up in the air, frozen in a cloud of anguish, despair, and tragedy. When it comes to clues in Amy Miljevic's case file, nothing major catches the eye as a big break in the investigation. Unfortunately, the era in which Amy perished was a time before detailed phone records were kept, and thus the location of the phone used by the suspect to converse with Amy, as well as the line Amy called from to tell her mother she was safe, cannot be identified. Had Amy been abducted a few years later, the shopping center in which she made contact with her kidnapper probably would have had CCTV monitoring systems installed that might have captured a better image of the suspects. Remember that Bay Village was thought to be as secure as a small community could be, and those types of measures were never even at the back of citizens' minds. All that being said, there are a few clues and missing artifacts sprinkled throughout the case that are worth magnification. Instead of one major piece of evidence or suspicious pattern, we want to bring awareness to the smaller details that could make the biggest difference. First of all, there were 3 significant items missing from Amy's person the day that her body was found in the field along County Road 1181. These personal artifacts were a pair of black horse riding boots, a denim backpack with an academic binder inside and the slogan "Best in Class" written on the clasp, and a pair of turquoise earrings shaped like horse heads. These items were unique enough to make an impression on Amy's parents and distinguishable enough for the general public to be on the lookout for. Distinguishable enough for the general public to be on the lookout for. Detectives assigned to the investigation remarked about how predators in these types of crimes often keep mementos of their victims like twisted trophies to keep for themselves. All of these missing objects could easily have been held onto by the killer as mementos. If any were found and identified, it could be a connection to Amy. The other peculiar point of interest wasn't covered in February, when multiple other girls came forward to investigators sharing similar stories of phone conversations with a man who wanted to buy them gifts for their mothers and meet up at shopping malls. These girls were also residents of northern Ohio suburbia in a town called North Olmsted, a neighboring community with Bay Village. While these girls were not friends with Amy directly, all of them had one conclusive connection to the Lake Erie Nature and Science Center. Detectives looked into the pattern and realized that the center utilized a visitor's log booth at the front door, which all of the girls, including Amy, will have signed upon their trips there. Along with signatures, the logbooks also included visitors' phone numbers and addresses, giving the predator an in-depth resource for his potential victim's location. How many logbooks the center kept throughout their history, and if they are archived, is unknown. Sadly, the discovery wasn't made until 17 years after Amy's murder, and thus going back and pinpointing suspects from any documents kept is nearly impossible. And if it was carried out, no leads were brought forth from it by authorities. However, we bring it up because it seems more than likely the perpetrator used the visitor log and possibly the center itself to find young women. If you have any information regarding the Lake Erie Nature and Science Center over the past 30 years that could be deemed relevant, it's important to reach out to proper officials. Or if you've heard of any similar instances of the phone calls being made in northern Ohio, it could lead to the best chance of finding the serial criminal. Now we turn to the theories surrounding Amy's murder. As with many missing and murdered children's cases, one of the oft-argued theories in the beginning of an investigation is the targeting of the parents and their potential involvement. Fortunately, in Amy's case, authorities were able to quickly rule out both Mark and Margaret Milhoich as suspects. They had both rock-solid alibis, as they were both at work and around co-workers. Some conspiracy theorists have tried to reason the parents might hire someone or convince a man to kidnap their daughter. But the truth of the matter was that Amy's parents had nothing to gain from carrying out such a bizarre scheme. It is a desperate hypothesis based on grasping at straws and should be put to rest for good. However, many of the other early theories did revolve around friends and family members close to the Milojevic family. These were the people most likely to have the knowledge of Margaret's employment situation as well as Amy's after-school routine and the telephone number to her residence. They would know of Amy's deep-rooted connection with her mother and her absolute will to do anything to make her happy. A child's compassion is usually seen and taken advantage of by people close to them, not by strangers or bystanders out to commit random crimes. Sadly, any and all of the possible persons of interest closely connected to the Mihalevics were intensely vetted by both the local police and the FBI special agents, and none are currently considered prime suspects. But there were a few promising individuals discovered by investigators through the first few years after Amy's body was found. The first was a former stable hand at Holly Hills Farms, where Amy would ride horses for recreation. His name was Sean Tabelian, who also went by Sean Dusky. Sean was kicked out of a previous labor position at a stables for tickling young girls, and he was accused of raping a 12-year-old girl in Washington state in 1983. And another person connected via Holly Hills Farms was Dr. Gregory Capella, whose daughter also rode horses alongside Amy. He faced accusations of writing love letters to a female minor asking to be her boyfriend, and would sleep in the same room as young girls when taking the youth soccer teams on trips to Canada. Both of the Holly Hills Farms men profiled only had circumstantial suspicions at best and were never arrested. Another set of suspects would arise due to their involvement with Amy's memorial events held around Bay Village soon after she disappeared. The first was Robert Jones, who attended a memorial service and handed Margaret $1,000 in cash. He didn't know the Mokolovic family on a personal level, making the kind transaction a bit odd. When investigators looked into Robert's, They discovered a pattern of strange behavior, such as his infamy around town for standing nude in front of the living room window as young girls walked by or simply staring at them as they ventured to school. He was also suspected of arson when the home he lived in burned down in 1989. But when the FBI obtained a search warrant to dig through his new home, nothing of note could be found. The other peculiar subjects targeted by police after Amy's memorial was an unnamed man featured in former FBI agent Robert Ressler's book, Whoever Fights Monsters. Ressler claimed the man went out of his way to volunteer in search efforts for Amy, handing out flyers and going door to door. The man also sent Margaret sympathy cards with hair pins attached telling Margaret that she and Amy would wear them when Amy was found. Thinking it to be a sign of involvement, Ressler and another FBI agent visited the man to thank him for his volunteer efforts before turning it into an interrogation. The man professed his innocence, but the police kept checking in on him. They found he had a history of mental and emotional issues and felt that they had found their man. Their gut reaction seemed to be validated when the man combined a lethal dosage of ethanol with his soda just weeks after Amy's body was found. After the man's suicide, Ressler and the FBI attempted to search his residence. But before they could act, the man's family had already cleaned and emptied the house, even donating his clothing to a Goodwill store. Years later, local police told investigators that the unidentified man in question had very little evidence linking him to Amy's case and was never seriously considered as a suspect. Despite having access to his belongings, no useful clues were found, and the man is no longer considered a prime suspect. In addition to this individual, there were a few other men in the Bay Village area who had disturbing histories involving minors and young girls, leading authorities to focus on them. One such person was Kenneth Robert Stanton, a serial molester who had moved to northern Ohio in 1989, just before Amy went missing. Stanton's modus operandi involved befriending young girls and learning when they would be home alone, gaining their trust before invading their homes. While police initially considered him a suspect because his behavior mirrored the potential actions of Amy's killer, there was no physical connection between him and her case. Another figure of interest was Dr. Frank Voken, a local Bay Village dentist known for making inappropriate advances toward female minors. Shortly after Amy's kidnapping, he moved out of the country, and those close to him reported that he had asked his family to send him updates on the fate of the missing girl. Despite these troubling behaviors, Vulcan's involvement remained speculative, and there was no concrete evidence linking him to Amy's disappearance either. What happened to Frank is unknown, but some say he had beaten his wife and fled to Costa Rica. One glaring problem with the investigation at large and a search for the perfect perpetrator is the fact that there are a disproportionate amount of registered sex offenders in the northern Ohio area, especially sprinkled around middle-class suburbs such as Bay Village and northern Olmsted. And if the list of known pedophiles and rapists is large, one can only imagine how big the list of unconfirmed and unknown criminals could be. Thus, the sheer number of names cycled through police reports and FBI investigations is too big to comprehend, let alone list with appropriate reason. If anything, this realization is all the more disturbing considering what happened to Amy may not be an isolated incident by a single serial predator with multiple victims, but rather a solo pedophile in the midst of countless others still out there carrying out their bidding in an uncontrolled circus of evil. Of all the men investigated, interviewed, and implicated in Amy's case, none stand out more than one suspicious figure researched by longtime journalist and expert on the case James Renner. In February, published an article for clevescene.co titled, quote, "Person of Interest detailing the history and his personal search for a man by the name of Dean Runkle." Dean Runkle wasn't just a character of the northern Ohio suburbs with vague connections to the Millowich family or a semi-shady past. Rather, Dean was the first and most prolific suspect intersecting with all of the girls who received strange calls from an unidentified male, and that he had worked as a volunteer at the Lake Erie Nature and Science Center in 1989. But none of the former employees of the center had remembered his name until a man named Tom Paksinski called up Renner in February and told him his former 8th grade science teacher in 1991 named Dean Runkle would talk about the Lake Erie Science Center to his classes. This was the volunteer both Renner and the FBI wanted to investigate, and thus the profiling endeavor began. Dean Runkle was born in New London, Ohio on a farmhouse only a few miles away from where Amy's body would be found on the County Road 1181 45 years later. He lived a tumultuous early life dealing with an abusive father, and the tragic death of his 6-year-old twin sister in 1950. Nevertheless, he went on to develop a love for science and biology and studied education at Bowling Green State University, finding employment soon after graduation as a 7th-grade science instructor at Vermilion Junior High School in 1967, already earning awards for his work by the end of his 2nd year. And on the surface, these awards made sense. He was a colorful individual implementing film and photography with his students, yet this habit seemed to run deeper into his private life, as he would take the videos and photos of his students home to cut and develop the film in his own residence. When he wasn't teaching, Dean took time to play ragtime piano at venues around the country, including Disneyland. By the time he returned to teaching, Dean Runkle assembled a miniature conservatory in his classroom with various animals and creatures. This led him to involve his students even more outside of lectures, calling them his assistants and allowing them to spend time at his home after school and on weekends whilst tending to the animal equipment. All of that changed abruptly in 1987 when Dean quit his position citing health concerns yet never gave the same explanation to either parents or administrators. He moved back to New London and worked at a pet store delivering mice to nature centers around the area, including the Lake Erie Science Center. It didn't take long before Dean secured another teaching position at Nord Junior High School, where he built another miniature zoo students as his after-school assistants once more. He maintained this position until February 3rd when Dean quit out of the blue once again. This time Dean truly left without reason, forgoing a sabbatical, retirement, and his pension. Curious about Dean's personality and relationship with his students, Renner reached out to over 500 of his former middle schoolers, now adults in the real world. By all accounts, he heard back a lot of positive feedback regarding Dean's infectious energy and how he inspired students to pursue degrees in biology or veterinary sciences. However, he also received a fair share of secrets revealing a darker side to Dean and a pattern of disturbing behavior. First were the stories of animal cruelty, like the time he pulled a prank on a friend by dipping a cat in liquid nitrogen, freezing it and letting it crash into a million pieces on the floor. Then there were the copious instances of creepy incidents with the kids. One girl was quoted by Renner in his article saying, quote, "It was more than creepy, it felt like an animal noticing you when you walk into a room." He had a few girls he was extra close to, like the girl who sat in front of me. I'd watch him put his left hand on her back and bend down to whisper in her ear. It seems inappropriate now the way he treated some of the girls. Another male student recalled Dean's propensity for telling jokes to the boys, going as far as to hint that he liked kids before they hit puberty because he was once, quote, a runt. Another former female student thought Dean was the closest match to a police sketch of Amy's kidnapper she had ever seen. She actually confronted him about it one day back in 1990 and told Renner, quote, "I said, I know you're the one who killed Amy." His eyes popped out of his head. He didn't say anything, just walked past me. For years later, and another female student of his came forward with a disgusting revelation when she overheard Dean tell a fellow administrator he wished he was the father of a baby held by a pregnant 8th grader. And that wasn't all. Atkins said Dean gave off incredibly uncomfortable vibes when they were alone, that he made suggestive comments about the clothes female students would wear and be very touchy with them, pressing his chest against them when he spoke in close quarters. Atkins and a few other girls were interviewed about these behaviors by their superintendent a year later in 1995. But that investigation is nowhere in Dean's professional records. One of the most glaring pieces of evidence against Dean is an incident that occurred with another student of his in which they were caught alone in Dean's gold-covered Pontiac Grand Prix. Both the school's principal and the police were aware of the situation, but let Dean off with nothing more than a warning. It's incredibly peculiar looking back on it when considering the make and model of the vehicle itself. Amy Miljevic's body was found with microscopic gold fibers researched to be those of a General Motors automobile. Most likely a model from the Grand Prix was just that, a gold-colored Pontiac manufactured by GM. Renner attempted to track it down to a junkyard only to find it had been scrapped years earlier. While there was only that single known instance of a kid being in Dean's car with him, there were more rumors that Dean had invited kids back to his actual apartment. The one boy who was confirmed to have actually gone inside was named Dan, who later told Renner that he was a favorite pupil of Dean's, and the two became quite close. They stayed in contact after Dan graduated high school, with Dean writing letters that grew sexual in nature. Dean went as far as to set aside a trust fund for Dan, but the two eventually tapered off in their conversations and Dean took the money back. And as for the time frame when their friendship ended completely, through the time of Amy's initial disappearance. When Renner carried out this investigation in February 8th, he paid a visit to Dean in Key West, Florida, where Dean had fled to in February 3rd and was managing a fast food restaurant ever since. Dean vehemently denied any involvement with Amy or her murder, saying he always cooperated with the FBI, including taking lie detector tests, and moved to Florida for health reasons. He claimed he was always at school after hours and wouldn't have the time to go to the shopping center and abduct Amy so soon after the final bell rang. When Renner confronted Dean about his relationship with Dan, Dean chalked it up to being a difficult time in his life, but maintained they never became physical with one another. Renner also asked Dean if he could have been at the Lake Erie Nature and Science Center in 1989, like Tom Paksinski claimed, and Dean told him he might have been but couldn't remember being there. Before he left, Renner asked one more question, wondering if Dean used a logbook at the Science Center to gather phone numbers of young girls from North Olmsted. Dean said he has nothing to confess to, that he was done talking and walked away. While the evidence is circumstantial at best, the clues and patterns associated with Dean definitely suggest something more sinister could have been at play. He had a childhood filled with trials and terrors, like facing beatings from his father. The death of his twin at such a young age is also theorized to be an underlying factor similarly seen in other criminals' upbringings. But of course, a tragic childhood does not mean someone will grow to be a criminal. More suspicious is the eyewitness testimonies of animal cruelty and pedophilic comments, including the possibility of inappropriate touching. He was familiar with the New London countryside, which investigators say is a key to the killer's placement of Amy's corpse on County Road 1181. He also had the all-important connection to the Lake Erie Nature and Science Center, and a known fascination with prepubescent girls. Not only that, but people have pointed out that when he refused to renew his teaching license and fled from the schooling system, it aligns with the time frame that states mandated all educators be fingerprinted for a national database to obtain a license. Top it off with a car that could have matched the description of the gold fibers on Amy's body, and everything seems to fit like the perfect puzzle piece. However, there is an equal chance Dean did not kidnap and kill Amy. One has to consider the slim chance he could have run out of school to make it to the shopping center in time to take her at the time she was abducted. Also remember that as a former teacher, the other kids would have easily recognized him, and those who did describe Amy's captor described him as having dark brown hair. Dean's hair is a dirty blonde. The FBI had Dean zeroed in as prime suspect number 1 for a while, but came out in 2019 that whoever did indeed murder Amy probably wasn't someone they had already investigated, making it sound that Dean had been cleared after years of interviews, past polygraphs, and extreme vetting processes. Like so many other names and suspects that were spewed in various theories, Dean Runkle became just that, just another maybe. Before we divulge our hypothesis of Amy Milojevic's unsolved murder, we want to make it known that our conclusions are purely logical speculation based on evidence, circumstance, and factual subtext. We are only privy to the same information presented in each video, and we do not attempt to promise certainty or an expert guarantee on the findings that we reach in closing. We simply observe, research, and reports. While the carousel of suspects in Amy's case is never-ending, we are confident the man who took Amy's life was a long-time resident of Northern Ohio, familiar with Bay Village and its neighboring communities. He was confident in his incredibly risky approach in contacting young girls, displaying a disregard for consequence yet a clinical skill set in remaining undetected. He was certainly a serial predator, and whether or not he has struck before is impossible to say, but without a doubt, he planned his strategies to the finest detail. The killer most certainly had connections to the Lake Erie Science and Nature Center. And if he wasn't an employee, he was probably a guest or volunteer who frequented enough to know about the logbook and understand it was a trove of phone numbers and contact information for his victims. He could also have worked at either General Motors or Trading Times magazine with one of Amy's parents, knowing their schedules as well as hers and coordinating his attack using this information. Ken Lanning, one of the founders of the Behavioral Science Unit for the FBI and interviewed in that same James Renner article previously discussed, makes very good points regarding the theoretical murderer. He talked about how most child molesters aren't actual killers, but rather influential figures who convince their victims to trust them. They only use violence as a last resort, say if the victim fights back or if the trust factor never leads to physical contact. Lenning continued to point out that serialized murdered children are often the result of strangers getting their hands tied behind their backs, for a perpetrator would be leaving too much of a trail to victimize someone close to them. Again, this is using the theory of a serial predator and not a one-off homicide. Amy's case fits Lanning's profile of a child molester attempting to seduce his targets, and her subsequent murder the effect of his ultimate failure to do so. Amy's nails were chipped when her corpse was found, signaling she fought her attacker until he gave up and took her life. So was Dean Runkle the man responsible? It's certainly possible, but so too are any of the other names the FBI listed in their investigation. The scariest part is that the killer could be someone nobody expected, someone who became so invisible, their face was never even considered. Not even the police sketches of the abductor give us a concrete answer, as law enforcement have said the drawing is a simple estimation and likely inaccurate. Ultimately, the path to a justified conclusion may lie in the eventual procurement of DNA evidence linked to a specific individual. Police did recover partial hairs that didn't belong to Amy or her family, and these have recently been submitted for DNA analysis. While it's uncertain whether a full DNA profile can be obtained without the root of the hair, the fact that such evidence is still being discovered 30 years later offers a glimmer of hope for further developments. In the end, we must remember Amy not for the tragic afternoon of October 27, 1989, but for the vibrant, joyful moments leading up to that day. Let us honor her infectious compassion and beautiful spirit, cherishing the memory of her delicate humanity. Think of Amy as the free-spirited, nature-loving young girl with infinite potential, a soul eager for adventure, a gifted mind, and someone who brought happiness to all who knew her. Remember her as the girl who loved horses and animals, offering comfort to living creatures around her. Rather than focusing on the sensationalized myths of the Bay Village boogeyman, what truly matters is preserving Amy Mihaljevich's memory, ensuring she is remembered with love and respect. And with unwavering hope, we hold out for the day when justice is finally served, bringing peace to Amy's family and honoring the life of a brilliant child who was taken far too soon. Christy Lynn Mullins. Christy Lynn Mullins was born on August 28, 1960, in Columbus, Ohio. She was part of a large family with 5 children and grew up in a quiet neighborhood, far from the noise of the city. During the summer of 1975, at the age of 14, Christy spent most of her time with her friends and sisters. Their favorite hangout spot was the pool at a nearby residential complex, especially on sweltering summer days. In addition to spending time with friends, Christy occasionally worked as a babysitter, caring for the children of people she knew. On August 22nd, one of them asked her to watch their child until late in the evening. The following day, Christy slept in until around noon and found herself wondering how to pass the time. With her birthday just 5 days away, she was filled with anticipation, making the hours seem to drag. The day was particularly scorching, with temperatures climbing to 93 degrees. Christy quickly decided that going to the pool would be the perfect way to pass the time and escape the heat. She took her younger sister, Kim, along, and the two headed to the residential complex. While Kim immediately jumped into the water, Christy chose to relax on a deck chair. Not long after, a friend approached her, and after a brief conversation, the two walked away together. Kim was surprised that her sister had left without saying anything but chose to stay at the pool rather than follow her. After some time, Kim returned home, only to find that Christy wasn't there. As the hours passed with no sign of her, she began to grow concerned. Determined to find her sister, Kim walked around the neighborhood searching for her. Along the way, she ran into a neighbor, who mentioned that the police had discovered a girl's body a few miles away about an hour earlier, but they hadn't been able to identify her. Before I continue, I want to remind you that only a small percentage of people who watch my videos are actually subscribed. So if you enjoy my content, consider subscribing. It's free and you can always change your mind later. Now let's move on with the video. Panicked, Kim rushed home to inform her parents, who immediately contacted the police, explaining that their daughter was missing. The family was instructed to go to the morgue, where officers presented them with the body of the deceased girl. At first, Christie's parents struggled to recognize her due to the severe bruising on her face. However, her mother soon spotted a familiar birthmark on the girl's leg and realized, with heartbreaking certainty, that it was Christie. Once her identity was confirmed, the police shared the devastating details of what had happened. At approximately 2:30 p.m., a man called 911 to report the discovery of a body in the wooded area behind a shopping center. He, his wife, and their son had gone there to buy a toy for their daughter. Before entering the store, their son asked to take a walk in the wooded area behind the building. The location was known for its scenic walking trail that led to the river, making it a popular spot for strolls. His parents agreed, and the family ventured along the path, exploring the forest. As they were making their way back, they noticed something unusual a few yards off the trail, something that immediately caught their attention. As they moved closer, they saw a man on the ground, leaning over someone and repeatedly striking them with a piece of wood. Upon noticing the family, the man immediately got up and fled. The father rushed to the spot and found a young girl lying on the ground, covered in blood. His wife, who had medical training, attempted to check for a pulse but was unable to find one. Realizing the urgency of the situation, the man sprinted to the shopping center and used a phone inside one of the stores to call the police. Both he and his wife provided investigators with a description of the attacker. He was described as a young man, around 20 years old, tall and slender, with shoulder-length dark hair. At the time of the attack, he was wearing only jeans, shorts, and boots. Using their account, the police created a sketch of the suspect and distributed it to patrol officers. However, despite examining the crime scene thoroughly, investigators found no significant evidence. Officers recovered the piece of wood used as the murder weapon, but they were unable to find any evidence that could lead them to the perpetrator. Notably, Christie's hands were bound with a telephone cord, and her bikini top had been pulled down. Her t-shirt and shoes were found next to her body, yet forensic experts found no signs of sexual assault. Investigators theorized that the attacker may have intended to assault her, but was interrupted and fled the scene. Despite the initial lack of leads, police soon had a direction to pursue. Christie's younger sister revealed that she had left the pool with a friend named Carol, prompting investigators to speak with her. Carol explained that earlier that day, she had received a phone call at home from an unknown man who claimed to be a DJ from a local radio station. He told her about an upcoming cheerleading competition in town, with the winners receiving free tickets to the state fair. According to him, the event was set to take place behind the shopping center at 1:45 p.m. The caller instructed Carol to wait at the entrance of the wooded trail, where someone would meet her and provide more details about the event. To the police, this story already seemed highly suspicious, but there were even more puzzling details. Carol explained that she originally planned to attend the event with her sister. However, on the way, they ran into Christie and her younger sister. After chatting briefly, Carol invited Christie to join her, leaving their sisters behind as they headed toward the shopping center. When the girls arrived at the entrance to the woods, they sat on a fence and waited, but no one ever showed up. After some time, Carol decided to go into the shopping center to check the time. She was only gone for a few minutes, but when she returned, Christie had vanished. Carol waited a little longer, but when no one appeared, she eventually left. Investigators could find no record of any cheerleading competition taking place in town. They speculated that the caller may have been the killer, attempting to lure Carol into the woods. Alternatively, it was possible that the call was an unrelated prank, and Christie's disappearance was a tragic coincidence. Regardless, authorities were unable to trace the call, making it impossible to determine the caller's identity. Investigators also noticed inconsistencies in Carol's account. She claimed that she ran into Christie and her sister while walking to the shopping center. However, Kim firmly maintained that they had been at the pool when Carol approached them there. But that wasn't the only suspicious detail. Later that evening, Christie's mother had a strange encounter with Carol, who lived just a short distance from their home. During their conversation, Carol unexpectedly began apologizing, saying that things were never supposed to escalate this far. She went on to claim that she was the intended target and that two people had been involved in the murder. Stunned, Christie's mother pressed for more details, but Carol abruptly ended the conversation and walked away. Alarmed by what she had just heard, Christie's mother immediately reported the conversation to the police. Investigators questioned Carol again, but this time, she denied ever making such a statement. She stood by her original story and refused to provide any additional information. Later, Carol underwent another round of questioning, this time with a polygraph test. The examiner found no indications of deception when she answered key questions. With no further evidence linking her to the crime, investigators shifted their focus elsewhere and continued searching for leads. As news of the brutal murder spread throughout the city, fear took hold of the local residents. People were on edge, knowing that a dangerous killer was still at large. The situation became even more unsettling when detectives shared their belief that the perpetrator was likely a local. The killer had demonstrated knowledge of the wooded trail behind the shopping center, an area familiar mostly to those who lived nearby. Determined to track down the suspect, detectives deployed all available resources. Then, 3 days after Christie's murder, they had their first major breakthrough. Around 5 p.m., a police officer patrolling the streets of Columbus spotted a man who bore a striking resemblance to the suspect's sketch. The officer immediately alerted detectives, who arrived at the scene without delay. They approached the man and asked if he would come to the station for questioning. Without resistance, he agreed. The man was identified as 25-year-old Jack Carmen. Although he willingly agreed to answer their questions, investigators quickly encountered a challenge. Jack had a significant intellectual disability. Various tests estimated his IQ to be around 50. He was under the care of a specialized medical facility and lived in an apartment provided by a non-profit organization, where he also worked. Jack was unable to read or write and had difficulty speaking clearly. However, detectives couldn't overlook his strong resemblance to the composite sketch of Christie's killer. The interrogation process proved to be extremely difficult. For most of the questioning, Jack either responded with single-word answers or remained completely silent. Investigators even began to question whether he fully understood the meaning of their questions. Despite these challenges, the interrogation continued for 6 hours. Progress was slow, but eventually, detectives began to gain some traction. By keeping their questions as simple and direct as possible, detectives eventually obtained a long-awaited confession from Jack. According to his account, he had left his apartment that day and taken a bus to the shopping center with the intention of buying new pants and a shirt. As he walked through the parking lot toward the entrance, he noticed Christie sitting on a fence near the start of the wooded trail. He claimed that he approached her, grabbed her, tied her hands, and dragged her into the woods, where he assaulted her. When Christie attempted to escape, Jack chased after her. He then picked up a piece of wood from the ground and struck her multiple times on the head before fleeing to the main road, where he caught a bus. The following day, police took him back to the crime scene, where he pointed out the exact location of the attack. He also provided details that only the perpetrator would know, including the fact that the wooden weapon had broken in half when he used it to strike the victim. To further verify his confession, detectives arranged a lineup, including Jack, and asked the witnesses who had discovered Christie to identify the man they had seen that day. Both pointed to Jack. He was charged with several offenses, including assault and murder. Despite the fact that experts didn't find any evidence of sexual assault, Jack confessed to it, so the prosecution decided not to exclude it. The prosecutors sought the death penalty, but Jack's lawyer, with his consent, struck a deal. Jack had to admit his guilt before the judge and receive a life sentence instead of execution. Given that thousands of people were closely following the case, events unfolded rapidly. On September 3rd, just 11 days after the murder, Jack was sentenced to life in prison. However, after the trial, doubts about his guilt began to surface. As more details about his confession and background were revealed in the media, many people started questioning whether he was truly responsible. Those who knew Jack personally found it hard to believe he could have committed such a violent act. According to them, he had never shown any signs of aggression. In fact, he was known to be passive, timid, and overly compliant. He had a history of agreeing to things just to appease others, even if they weren't true. For instance, while at a charity center, he once took the blame for breaking a boiler, even though someone else was responsible. Questions also arose about whether Jack had even been capable of confessing to the crime in the way detectives claimed. He could barely speak, yet the police claimed that he had told them about the crime in utmost detail. Those who knew Jack believed that the investigators had simply fed him all the necessary information. They just needed to ask leading questions that already contained facts about the case. For example, did he strike the victim with a piece of wood? And if Jack answered yes, the police could already use it as a confession. One woman who was involved in Jack's treatment added that under threat, he could confess to anything. It was enough for him to hear that he faced the electric chair and he would do whatever the detectives asked. But that's not all. Supporters of Jack's innocence found out that the police had brought him to the murder scene at the same time as the witnesses. The same married couple who later identified him among other people at the police station. So, they had already seen Jack and knew that he was a suspect. The police had claimed that the witnesses didn't cross paths with Jack, but no one believed it. There were many more facts that raised strong doubts about Jack's involvement. For example, the police couldn't find the bus driver or even a single who saw Jack on the way to the city center. According to his own confession, that's how he got home. But the most significant factor was the testimony of several people in the charity organization building where Jack lived and worked. They claimed to have seen him around 1:30 p.m. If he was indeed there, he had absolutely no chance of taking a bus to the shopping center on the outskirts of the city and committing the murder by 1:50 p.m. Even if he had left immediately after being seen by the witnesses, even Christie's parents started to doubt that he was the real killer. On September 9th, just 6 days after the verdict, around 70 people gathered in front of the city hall to draw attention to the case and demand a thorough investigation. Determined to seek justice, supporters formed a public committee advocating for Jack's case to be re-examined. This effort helped Jack secure a new lawyer, who quickly filed for a case review. Several months later, a judge ruled to revoke Jack's confession and ordered a new trial. Now, the prosecution had to build their case from the ground up, an extremely difficult task given the circumstances. While preparations for the retrial were underway, Christie's father, Norman Mills, launched his own investigation. From the very beginning, he doubted the detectives' work, believing they weren't doing enough to find his daughter's real killer. Unwilling to rely solely on law enforcement, he took matters into his own hands. Shortly after the murder, Norman and some neighbors went to the woods to inspect the area themselves. There, a pair of jean shorts and blood-stained men's underwear. Evidence that the police had initially overlooked. They turned the items over to investigators, raising even more concerns about how thoroughly the case had been handled. However, it remained unknown whether these items were linked to the case or even tested. The new trial for Jack began only in 1977, 2 years after the murder. The defense had two tasks: first and foremost, to prove Jack's innocence, and also to try to identify the real killer. In fact, they already had a pretty strong candidate for this role, whom they considered the most likely suspect, the man who found Christie's body with his wife. His name was Henry Newell, and at the time of the murder, he was 25 years old. By the start of the trial, Jack's lawyers had gathered an impressive list of reasons to suspect Henry for the murder, and during the trial, this list grew even longer. Initially, Henry drew attention because of his criminal record. Starting from his teenage years, he had been arrested numerous times for various offenses, serving 3 prison terms. He had successfully escaped from jail twice before being caught and sent back. At the time of Jack's trial, he was serving his 4th sentence. This time, Henry had set his own house on fire to collect insurance money. The lawyers had also reviewed the evidence from Christie's case and found several very suspicious details. In his testimony, Henry said he found her body, ran up to it, and tossed aside a blood-stained piece of wood. He explained this by saying he was in a state of shock at the time, but such an action still seemed odd. Why would he pick up the murder weapon and throw it away from the body without any apparent reason? He claimed he thought the girl was still alive, so he took off his shirt and pressed it to her face. This action also raised questions. Did he really try to stop the bleeding? Or did his shirt get bloody during the murder and he needed to justify it somehow? Jack's lawyers found a store employee in the mall where Henry ran to call the police. She said he wasn't wearing a shirt, but had jean shorts on, although by the time the police arrived, he was already wearing different pants. The employee also claimed Henry had a fresh spruce on his face, as if someone had hit him. When asked why she didn't immediately tell the police about this, she said no one simply asked her. The officers themselves should have noticed the spruce, but they ignored it. Back then, Henry also agreed to take a polygraph test, but he ended up vomiting right on the machine, so the police didn't arrange a new test. Another witness was Henry's neighbor. He said that on the night of the murder, he spoke with Henry and noticed many fresh scratches on his hands. The man also mentioned seeing a telephone cord in Henry's garage of the same color and shape as the one used to tie the victim's hands. But that's not all. The neighbor stated that Henry once told him a very strange story. He claimed to know Carol, Christie's 14-year-old friend, and that they used to swim naked together in the pool. Considering he was 25 at the time, this story shocked everyone's case. However, finding any direct evidence that this actually happened was simply impossible. Yet, it indicated that Henry was acquainted with Carol, who also had a direct connection to the case. His wife, Pam, also testified in court. She said everything had happened exactly as they told the police on the first day. They went to the mall and their son wanted to take a walk. They went to the woods and found the body. Pam added that up until that point, Henry had been at home and only stepped out for a few minutes to chase away the neighborhood kids who had started throwing firecrackers into their yard. Carol also testified. She stated that she had never met Henry. She was also asked about what she had meant when she told Mother that things shouldn't have escalated so far. But Carol once again claimed she didn't remember saying anything like that. Henry himself was also brought into the courtroom from prison. He repeated his story without any changes and insisted that he had nothing to do with the crime. One of the most significant moments of the trial was the display of the full recording of Jack's interrogation. After viewing it, it became apparent to everyone that Jack was simply coerced into confirming the detective's words that he had committed the murder. Jack barely spoke and apparently didn't fully understand what the police wanted from him. But that wasn't the most crucial moment of the trial. On the fifth day, another unexpected witness appeared, either anticipated by the prosecution nor Jack's lawyers. It was Bobby, Henry's stepson, and his testimony truly shocked everyone following the case. The boy revealed that on that day, Henry did indeed leave the house to chase away kids throwing firecrackers in their yard. However, he was gone for more than just a few minutes, as his mother had claimed, but for over half an hour. When Henry returned home, his shirt and sandals were missing, and he had scratches on his arms and face. Henry called Pam into another room, where they had a conversation. After that, they came out and told Bobby that they were all going to the shopping center. Upon arriving, the parents immediately led him to the trail behind the shopping center. The boy claimed that he hadn't asked to go there for a walk, as his parents had initially stated. They entered the woods and almost immediately found Henry's sandals, one of which was torn. A little further, they saw Christie's body, and his mother instructed Bobby never to tell anyone about what he saw. The boy added that he only decided to tell the truth after having a conversation with his biological father, who had convinced him to do the right thing. His grandmother also testified in court and recounted one strange episode involving Henry. She, along with him and Pam, attended Christie's farewell ceremony. On the way back, the woman said what a tragedy it was, and Henry suddenly replied, "It will teach her to keep her mouth shut." Another witness was Henry's friend. He said that Henry once confessed to him that he killed Christie. He added that the killing was accidental, not planned. In the end, this trial left practically no doubt that Jack had no involvement in the crime, and eventually, all charges against him were dropped. But here's where it gets interesting. Despite the overwhelming evidence pointing to Henry's involvement, the prosecutor stated that he had no intention of pursuing it. He pointed out that the police either failed to notice or ignored a vast amount of clues and evidence available to them from day one. His response sparked a wave of public outrage. It reached such heights that 2 days later, the prosecutor had to backtrack and agree to reopen the investigation into Christie's case. But here was a serious problem. Investigators relied on the initial investigation, including the testimonies of Henry and Pam. In other words, the police still operated under the assumption that the couple stumbled upon Christie's body in the woods, with a long-haired, shirtless man looming over her. For this reason, investigators stated that they would be looking for new suspects resembling Jack. Of course, such an approach yielded no results. The investigation continued for several months, and eventually this case went cold. Christie's father never gave up on seeking justice. Once, he filed a civil lawsuit against Jack. But the reason for such a move were not as simple as it might have seemed. The man didn't believe in Jack's involvement in the murder. But this legal process would have granted him access to the case files, giving him the opportunity to collect all the available information. Unfortunately, this also yielded no results. In February 2006, Christie's father passed away from cancer, never having closure in the case. For a long time, there was no progress in the investigation of Christie's murder until February 2013, when former attorney John Aller took an interest in the case. He decided to conduct his own investigation, reaching out to all involved parties, hoping to find new leads. Christie's relatives handed him a box containing all of her father's records, which he had been gathering up until his death. Aller went through them all, spoke to dozens of people, and it became evident to him that the culprit behind this murder was none other than Henry. During his investigation, he found out that Christie's friend, Carol, was into smoking marijuana at the time. Digging deeper, he uncovered something else and concluded that she, like some other teenagers, apparently was buying it from Henry. This became another link between him and Carol and could indicate the real reason why the girl went to that forest. He theorized that the whole story about the DJ was simply made up, and in reality, Carol arranged to meet Henry in the forest to buy the illegal substance. Perhaps, she decided to invite Christie along under some other pretext, such as using the same story about the DJ in cheerleading competition. Another, much darker version suggested that Carol may have initially lured Christie there at Henry's request, who had planned to assault her. However, the girl fought back, as evidenced by the scratches and bruises on his body, and the man killed her. Delving deeper into the case, Uller discovered that by that time, Henry had committed even more crimes, including arson, domestic violence, and assault. There was another incident linked to him, but he wasn't tried for it, the death of his wife, Pam. In 1982, she filed for divorce, and just a month later, she was found dead in their apartment where she still lived with Henry. The official cause of death was a sleeping pill over the house, and the police found a note indicating that she did it herself. Pam's relatives didn't believe this version and suspected that Henry had tampered with the pills. The strangest part of this whole story was that no package of sleeping pills was found in the apartment, even though Pam obviously couldn't have disposed of it after taking such a large amount. That same year, 2013, when Aller took on the case, Henry passed away from cancer at the age of 63. Despite this, Aller continued his work and released a book containing all available information about Christie's murder. The release of the book sparked a new wave of interest in the case, and Christie's relatives, along with other people, began demanding to reopen the investigation. Several of Henry's relatives who killed the girl, but kept silent. One of them recounted that a few months before her 16th birthday, Henry had given her a car as a gift. They went for a ride together, and at some point he asked her to stop, looked at her, and said that he had killed Christie, detailing the crime in full. The woman said she couldn't believe it. According to her, Henry had been drinking a lot, and she thought he had simply made up this story under the influence of alcohol. However, after reading Alla's book, everything fell into place for her. All of this led to the reopening of the murder investigation in May of 2014. For many months, detectives re-examined all the available evidence, interviewed dozens of people, and re-evaluated the leads. In his confession to his relative, Henry mentioned that he had assaulted Christie. At the time of the original investigation, medical experts found no evidence of sexual assault. However, with advancements in forensic technology, Christie's clothing was re-examined decades later, revealing traces of semen. Unfortunately, the sample was too small for DNA analysis, preventing investigators from definitively identifying the perpetrator. The case remained open until late 2015, when detectives held a press conference. 40 years after Christie's murder, they publicly announced that they were certain Henry was responsible. However, since Henry had passed away, they could not prosecute him, and the case was officially declared solved and closed. Without a confession from Henry, investigators could never be completely certain about every detail of what happened that day. However, based on their findings, they pieced together a likely scenario. They suspected that Henry had gone to the wooded trail behind the shopping center that day, possibly to meet Carol for a drug deal. While they couldn't confirm Carol's involvement, the theory suggested that her presence may have played a role in Christie's tragic fate. Once Henry spotted Christie alone, he allegedly decided to attack her. He restrained her hands using a phone cord and led her deeper into the woods, where she fiercely resisted. Christie managed to scratch and strike him, but Henry overpowered her, knocking her down before fatally striking her with a piece of wood. Afterward, he returned home and confided in his wife, and together, they devised a plan to shield him from any consequences. Notably, Carol never came forward with the full truth, even after all these years. There remains a possibility that she was involved in some capacity, though whether she will ever disclose more details is uncertain. During their press conference, the police formally apologized to Christie's family, acknowledging the failures of the original investigators. Evidence that could have pointed to Henry as the culprit had been available from the start, yet it was either overlooked or disregarded. In the end, while the case was officially closed, lingering questions remain.